The morning it all changed, Harlan Briggs didn't even bother to lower his voice. He stood at the edge of her fence, her land, her 4 acres of turned earth, and he laughed. Not a polite laugh, not even a mean one. It was the kind of laugh a man makes when he doesn't think the person he's laughing at is worth the effort of cruelty. Casual, dismissive, like watching a child try to lift something too heavy and knowing you won't bother to help because you've already decided they'll fail. 300 pots, he said to the 2 men beside him, loud enough that Tamsin could hear every syllable from where she stood 30 feet away. Girl spent her last dollar on 300 clay pots. Gonna bury 'em in the ground. He shook his head slowly, the grin spreading wide across his sun-cracked face. Some people just weren't built for this land. Tamsin heard it, every word. She didn't turn around. She picked up her shovel and drove it into the earth. If you've ever been told you don't belong somewhere, really told, not by words but by the way people look right through you, then you already understand something about Tamsin Rourke before I say another word. Before we go further, if this is your first time here, welcome. If you've been with us a while, you already know we don't do things halfway on this channel. We tell the whole story. The hard parts, the quiet victories, the moments that make you catch your breath. If that's what you're here for, hit subscribe right now and turn on the bell. Because the stories we're telling aren't ones you want to walk into halfway through. And when you're done watching, drop a comment below and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. It means more than you know. Now, let's go back to Wyoming, 1887. And let's talk about a young woman who did something so stubborn, so unlikely, and so exactly right that an entire valley had to rearrange everything it thought it knew. Tamsin Rourke was 23 years old, and she weighed more than most people thought a woman living alone on a homestead should weigh. She knew this because people told her, not always with words. They told her with glances at the size of the plow handles. They told her when they offered help she hadn't asked for in a tone that suggested they expected her to fail before she started. They told her when women at the general store smiled just a little too slowly, sizing her up the way they sized up livestock, weighing whether the investment would yield a return. She had filed her homestead claim 14 months before the spring of 1887. 160 acres of Wyoming grassland with a creek running along the northern edge and a deep-cut gully to the south that flooded once in spring and dried hard as brick by August. The land office clerk had looked at her filing papers, looked at her, and looked at her papers again. "You got someone helping you with this?" he'd asked. "No, sir." "Someone to co-sign?" "Just me." He'd processed the paperwork, but she'd seen his expression, and it lived in her chest for months afterward like a splinter she couldn't reach. The first year was brutal in the specific way that first years on homestead claims were brutal. Not dramatically, not cinematically, but in the grinding, relentless accumulation of problems that never quite became catastrophes but never quite resolved either. Her north fence line kept collapsing in sections because the posts were set in soil that froze wrong. Her seed order arrived late and incomplete. She lost 11 chickens to something that dug under the coop wall in October and was never identified. She made it through the winter on stores she'd stretched further than she thought possible, eating in a deliberate, calculated way that left her tired in a bone-deep manner that sleep never fully addressed. But she made it. And in the spring of 1887, she was still there. The problem was the mountain. Tamsin had grown up in Missouri, where water was something you took for granted the way you took for granted air. You worried about floods, not droughts. You worried about rain ruining the hay, not the absence of rain turning the hay to straw. She had learned Wyoming water by making mistakes with it, and by the second year she had started paying attention to the snowpack on the mountains the way an experienced farmer read clouds. In early March of 1887, she climbed to the highest point of her property and looked west. What she saw made her stomach drop. The peaks were thin, not bare. It wasn't that dramatic. But the white line that should have stretched broad and heavy across the upper ridges was narrow, patchy, interrupted by exposed rock that had no business being visible before April. She had talked to an old trapper the previous autumn who had described what a thin snowpack year looked like in Wyoming. He'd said it with a kind of flat resignation that she hadn't understood then. She understood now. She did the calculations on a piece of paper that evening, sitting at the table in her cabin with a lantern burning low to save oil. Creek volume in a normal year, estimated reduction in snowmelt, estimated evaporation rate in a dry summer. The numbers were rough. She had no formal training in any of this, but she'd been reading every agricultural pamphlet she could get, every government report on Western water management she'd requested through the post. And the picture she assembled from rough numbers was clear enough. 60 days. Maybe 65 if the summer stayed mild, which it showed no signs of doing. She had 60 days of reliable creek water, maybe, and then the creek would stop. She sat with that number for a long time. Most people in the settlement were not sitting with that number, because most people in the settlement had not spent the winter reading government water reports. They were planning spring planting the same way they planned it every year. They would put seed in the ground, they would hope for rain, and if the creek ran low, they would haul water until it didn't run low anymore, because in most years that's what happened. The creek ran low, it rained, the creek came back. Tamsin did not believe it was going to rain enough this year. She needed a different solution. She found it in a pamphlet that had arrived crumpled and water-stained in a packet of government agricultural materials she'd requested 6 months earlier. Most of the pamphlet was about irrigation trenching, which she'd already read extensively and which required more water, not less. But there was a single paragraph near the back about an ancient practice. She thought it might have been Persian in origin, though the pamphlet was vague on this point, involving unglazed clay vessels buried near plant roots that allowed water to seep slowly into the surrounding soil rather than evaporating from the surface. She read that paragraph 4 times, then she read it a 5th time. The logic was clean and simple in the way that only the best solutions are. You lose most of your water to evaporation when you water from the surface. But if you put the water underground, directly next to the roots, almost none of it evaporates. The plant takes nearly everything you give it. You use a fraction of the water for the same result. A fraction. She stared at the word. In a 60-day water scenario, a fraction was the difference between alive and dead. The problem was the vessels themselves. She would need unglazed clay pots, porous enough to weep moisture slowly, sealed enough to hold water for days before releasing it all. She could not make them herself. She did not have a kiln, she had no clay working experience, and she did not have time to learn. She needed a potter. She asked at the general store in early April. The owner, a man named Fletcher, who had always treated her with the particular brand of politeness that carried a baseline of condescension underneath, told her he didn't know of any potters in the area. She asked the mail carrier. She asked at church. She didn't attend for religious reasons particularly, but it was the largest gathering of local people and therefore the most efficient place to ask questions. Nobody knew of a potter. She wrote 3 letters to people in distant counties and waited. She kept working. She turned her south field. She shored up the fence posts. She repaired the coop wall. She checked the creek every 3 days and marked the water line on a stick. She pushed into the bank, and the marks moved steadily downward in the way she'd expected them to. The second week of May, a wagon pulled into the settlement that she hadn't seen before. She was at the general store when it arrived. The wagon was heavy and moved slowly, and the man driving it was older than she expected, 60s maybe, with hands so permanently marked by clay and kiln work that the staining looked almost like a second skin. He was heading south, he said, toward a homestead community 3 valleys over where there was apparently demand for practical pottery. He was stopping here only to rest his horses and buy provisions. Tamsin was standing close enough to hear this conversation with Fletcher. She said, "Excuse me, are those all unglazed?" The potter turned and looked at her with the slightly startled expression of a man who had not noticed her standing there. "Some glazed, some not," he said. "Depends what you need 'em for." "How many unglazed do you have?" He thought about it. "Maybe 300, give or take. They're the ones that haven't sold well. People want glazed for kitchen use. The unglazed ones, I mostly sell to—" "I'll buy all of them," Tamsin said. The potter blinked. Fletcher, behind the counter, made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "All 300, she said. "What's the price?" "What?" She had $41 saved. It was everything she had that wasn't land or tools or livestock. The $41 was her emergency reserve, her buffer against anything going wrong, her single financial cushion between herself and complete ruin. She had accumulated it over 14 months of selling eggs, selling a small amount of salted pork, and charging a neighboring family $1 a month to use her root cellar storage during the previous winter. The potter named his price per pot. She did the math in her head. It came to $38 and some change. She paid it. When she counted the coins and bills into his hand, her own hand was completely steady. She had made this decision over the course of 14 months without knowing it. All those water reports, all those creek measurements, all that time staring at the mountain in March. She wasn't panicking, she was executing. The potter looked at her money, looked at her, and seemed to decide she knew something he didn't. "You want help unloading?" he offered. "Yes, thank you." She should have anticipated what would happen when people saw the wagon pull up to her property. In a settlement of 40-some families spread across a valley with nothing much happening on a Thursday afternoon, a wagon stopping at the widowed, no, never married, the unmarried young woman's homestead was already interesting enough to draw attention. When the unloading began and people started counting the clay pots being stacked at the edge of her field, the interesting became absurd. Harlan Briggs arrived before they were halfway done. Harlan Briggs was the largest landowner in the valley, which in practical terms meant he was the person whose opinion settled most arguments before they started. He was not a bad man in the way that villains in stories are bad. He didn't scheme or plot or pursue cruelty for its own sake. He was simply a man who had been right about enough things over enough years that he had lost any real curiosity about whether he might be wrong. He looked at Tamsin's clay pots the way he looked at most things he didn't understand, not with interest, but with the comfortable certainty that his not understanding them was a reliable indicator of their uselessness. He stood at her fence with two neighboring men, and he said what he said about the pots, and Tamsin heard every word. She picked up her shovel and drove it into the earth. What Briggs didn't see, because men like Briggs rarely looked closely enough to see it, was what was happening in Tamsin's face when she turned away from him. Not shame, not anger, exactly. Something harder than anger and quieter than shame. The particular expression of a person who has been underestimated so many times that the underestimation has stopped being wounding and has started being useful information about who is and isn't worth her time. She drove the shovel in again. Harlan Briggs watched her for a few minutes, made another comment to his companions that she didn't catch, and walked away. Tamsin kept digging. She spent that night at her table with paper and a pencil, not eating dinner until nearly 9 o'clock because she lost track of time in the calculations. 4 acres, 300 pots. The spacing needed to ensure root coverage for corn, beans, and squash, the 3 crops that could feed her through a winter if they produced well. She'd read about companion planting, the old method of growing these 3 together so they supported each other. The corn, tall for the beans to climb, the beans fixing nitrogen in the soil, the squash spreading broad leaves that shaded the ground and cut evaporation. Cut evaporation, even on the surface. Every piece of this plan was about cutting evaporation. She drew the grid on 4 sheets of paper taped together. 300 small circles, spaced at intervals she'd calculated based on root spread estimates from her pamphlets. It was not a perfect plan. She knew that. She was working from secondhand information and her own rough math. But it was a plan, and it was the best one she had, and it was based on something real. She ate her cold dinner, washed the single dish, and went to bed. Before sunrise, she was in the field with her shovel. The first pot went into the ground at approximately 5:45 in the morning of May 19, 1887. She did not mark this time for any ceremonial reason. She marked it because she was keeping a journal. A meticulous, factual journal that she'd been maintaining since the first day of her claim. And the journal entry for that morning noted the time because she was trying to track how long each pot took to bury at proper depth. She needed to know how long 300 of them would take. She needed to know if she could physically do this alone. Each pot needed to go in about 14 inches deep, with the neck just below the soil surface. She needed to pack the earth back around it firmly enough that it wouldn't shift, but loosely enough that the moisture would still be able to move outward through the surrounding soil. Too loose, and the pot would lean, and the neck might break when she came back to fill it. Too tight, and the clay couldn't do its work. She found the right pressure by the 8th pot. By midday, she had done 19. Her lower back was already telling her things she didn't want to hear. She ate lunch standing up because she didn't trust herself to sit down and get back up without losing significant time to stiffness. A biscuit from that morning and a piece of hard cheese and water from her canteen, and she stood in the middle of her 4 acres and looked at what she'd done and what remained to be done, and for a moment, just a moment, she felt the specific vertigo of a person who has committed completely to something enormous and is only now beginning to understand its full weight. 281 pots still sat stacked at the edge of the field. She put the last of the cheese in her mouth, picked up the shovel, and walked to pot 20. 9 days. That's how long it took her to bury all 300. 9 days of digging from before sunrise until the light failed, with breaks short enough that she could account for every one of them. Her hands blistered, cracked, bled slightly, and then hardened in the particular way that hands harden when you simply refuse to stop using them. Her shoulders developed a deep, grinding ache that wasn't sharp enough to be injury, but was constant enough to be its own kind of punishment. She slept heavily and dreamlessly each night, and was out of bed before she fully understood she was awake. The neighbors had stopped coming to watch by day 3. The spectacle of a young woman digging holes had been interesting for exactly as long as it seemed like it might produce some visible disaster, and once it became clear she was going to methodically complete the work without incident, the entertainment value dissolved. They went back to their own fields and their own spring planting. Good, Tamsin thought. Let them go. On the 9th day, she buried the last pot, pressed the earth down around it with both hands, and sat back on her heels in the dirt. She was filthy from the knees down, and her shoulders felt like they belonged to someone older. She had 43 holes in her palms she could count if she wanted to, though she'd stopped counting several days ago. She sat in the turned earth of her field as the light went amber and thin across the Wyoming valley, and she felt, not triumphant, nothing as clean as that, but certain. The kind of certainty that has nothing to do with confidence or optimism and everything to do with having done the work. She planted the next morning. Corn, beans, squash, in the companion configuration she'd planned, one seed cluster around each buried vessel, spaced so the roots would reach the slow weeping of moisture through the porous clay walls. She moved through the planting with the same methodical efficiency as the digging. No wasted motion, no sentimentality, just the work done as well as she knew how to do it. Then she waited. By late June, the thing she'd known was coming finally arrived. The heat settled into the valley like something with weight and intention. The creek, which had been shrinking in the steady, deniable way that slow disasters always begin, dropped below the point where she'd marked possible on her stick, and then below possible, and then on July 2nd it simply stopped moving. The water sat in disconnected pools in the lowest depressions of the creek bed, shrank, and within a week was gone. The valley did not panic immediately. People had seen dry summers before. There would be rain, there had to be rain, there was always rain eventually. They continued their routines with the particular determination of people who are very afraid and cannot afford to show it. Tamsin was afraid too. She didn't pretend otherwise, not to herself. Fear was appropriate here. Fear was the correct response to a situation where everything you had was at stake. The question was what you did with the fear, and she had answered that question for herself at 5:45 in the morning on May 19th when she drove the first shovel into the earth. Every morning before dawn, she drew water from her well, which, unlike the creek, was fed from a deeper source and filled a wooden barrel, loaded it onto a 2-wheeled handcart she'd rigged with a crossbar, and pulled it across the field. At each buried pot, she lifted the soil at the neck, fit her ladle into the opening, and measured in exactly the amount she'd calculated would sustain the plant without draining her well faster than it could recover. Not a drop on the surface. Every drop underground, where it couldn't evaporate, where the clay would release it slowly over days directly to the roots that needed it. It was slow, exhausting work. There was nothing elegant about it. She was a large, tired young woman pulling a heavy cart across a Wyoming field in the dark before sunrise, ladling water into holes in the ground, and the romance of that image existed only in retrospect if it existed at all. But her corn was growing. By the 3rd week of July, what was happening on Tamsin Rourke's property had become impossible to ignore, and the people who had laughed at her clay pots in May were now doing something else entirely when they passed her fence. They were going quiet. The valley around her field had turned the yellow-brown color that meant the end of things. That specific Wyoming drought color that experienced settlers learned to read the way sailors read certain clouds. Neighboring corn had stopped growing and started dying. Bean plants had dropped their leaves as a last resort conservation measure, bare stems standing in the heat like small surrenders. A family 2 properties north of her had already begun the grim calculation of what could be sold, what could be eaten through winter, and what was simply lost. And Tamsin's field was green, not lush, not miraculous looking. She couldn't claim that. The corn wasn't as tall as she'd hoped. The beans were working harder than they should have to. But they were alive, and they were growing. And in the context of everything dying around them, alive and growing was so extraordinary that people couldn't look away. She was coming back from a morning water run one day in late July when she saw a woman she recognized, the wife of a farmer named Garrett, who worked land about a mile east, standing at her fence line. The woman was just standing there, not speaking, not calling out, just looking at the field with an expression Tamsin couldn't fully read from a distance. Tamsin stopped pulling the cart. The woman looked at her, then looked at the field, then looked back at her. "How?" she said. Not a question with a question mark, just the word. Tamsin looked at her for a moment. "Come by some evening," she said, "and I'll show you." The woman nodded once, slowly, and walked away. Tamsin stood in the heat and watched her go. Then she turned back to the field and counted the rows she had left to water, picked up the cart handles, and kept moving. There was still a lot of summer left, and the well, for now, was holding. The woman's name was Clara Garrett, and she did not come by that evening. She came 3 days later, and she did not come alone. Tamsin was pulling the empty cart back toward the well for her second run of the morning when she heard the gate latch. She turned and saw Clara Garrett walking up the path with 2 other women, Margaret Howell, whose husband farmed the land directly west, and an older woman Tamsin knew only as Mrs. Price, who had lived in the valley longer than anyone, and whose opinions carried the particular weight of someone who had survived enough hard years to have earned them. All 3 women were moving with the careful, deliberate pace of people who had discussed coming here, argued about it probably, and arrived still not entirely sure it was the right decision. Tamsin set down the cart handles. "Morning," she said. Clara nodded. "We were wondering—" She stopped, started again. "Margaret's corn is done. All of it." Tamsin looked at Margaret Howell. Margaret was a compact, practical woman in her late 30s who Tamsin had exchanged exactly 12 words with in 14 months. Now her jaw was set in the particular way that women set their jaws when they are about to say something that costs them something. "My husband thinks it'll rain," Margaret said. "I don't think it'll rain." "It might rain," Tamsin said honestly, "but probably not enough." A pause settled between the 4 of them that had more information in it than the words surrounding it. "How does it work?" Mrs. Price asked. She wasn't looking at Tamsin when she said it. She was looking at the field. "The pots." Tamsin wiped her hands on her trousers. "Come on, I'll show you." She walked them to the nearest row and crouched down, brushing aside the dry surface soil with her palm until the neck of a buried pot was visible. She explained the principle the same way she'd first understood it, not as a sophisticated technique, but as a simple fact about where water goes when you put it in different places. On the surface, the sun takes most of it before the roots can. Underground, at root level, the plant takes nearly all of it before the sun gets a chance. "The clay seeps," she said. "It's not sealed. The water weeps through the walls slowly, over days. The roots grow toward the moisture. By the time I come back to refill, the surrounding soil is damp a foot in every direction." Mrs. Price crouched beside her with the slow deliberateness of a woman whose knees gave her trouble and who refused to acknowledge it. She pressed 2 fingers into the soil 6 inches from the pot neck. She looked up at Tamsin. "It's damp," she said. The way she said it, not as a compliment, not as surprise, but as the simple registration of a fact that rearranged something, told Tamsin everything about what this visit was actually about. "Yes," Tamsin said. Clara Garrett made a sound that wasn't quite a word and turned away, looking out across the field. From where they stood, you could see exactly where Tamsin's property ended and the Garrett land began, because the line between green and brown was that precise. "How much water?" Clara asked without turning around. "Per day. Per pot," Tamsin told her. She told her the exact amount she ladled into each vessel, the timing between refills, the well depth, the recovery rate she'd estimated. She told her all of it without softening it or making it sound easier than it was, because these women were not here for comfort, they were here for numbers. Margaret Howell had pulled a small notebook from her apron pocket and was writing. Tamsin noticed this and felt something she hadn't expected. Not pride, but a kind of relief, like a weight she hadn't known she was carrying shifted slightly. "The work is hard," Tamsin said. I won't tell you otherwise. Every morning before light. You can't miss a day in this heat. My husband won't do it, Margaret said flatly, still writing. He'll think it's ridiculous. He'll say we should wait for rain. Will he stop you from doing it yourself? Margaret looked up from the notebook. The question sat between them for a moment. No, she said finally. He won't stop me. Mrs. Price had risen slowly to her feet and was looking at the corn. Not Tamsin's corn specifically, but the particular height of it versus what corn should have been doing in late July, running calculations in her head that her expression didn't show, but her eyes did. Where would we get pots? She asked. The potter who sold me mine was heading south, Tamsin said. I don't know if he's still in the area, but unglazed clay mud, even cracked pots, ones that wouldn't sell for kitchen use, would work. The imperfections don't matter. They just need to hold water long enough for it to seep. I've got 6 cracked pitchers, Clara said quietly. Been meaning to throw them out. Don't, Tamsin said. The 3 women left an hour later, and Tamsin stood at her gate and watched them walk back down the path toward the road. She did not feel the way she might have expected to feel. Not warm, not hopeful in any uncomplicated way. What she felt was more complicated than that because she knew that 6 cracked pitchers across 4 acres of dying corn was not going to save the Garrett family's harvest. And she knew that what these women had really come for was something she couldn't fully give them, which was certainty. Nobody could give them certainty. She could give them a method, and she could give them honest numbers, and she could give them the truth that the method worked. Her green field was the proof of that. But she couldn't promise their wells would hold, or that the heat would break before it should, or that the labor of it wouldn't be more than a woman running a farm alone or nearly alone could physically sustain. She went back to the well and started filling the barrel. The hard business of the drought was still going on regardless of anything else, and she had 87 pots left on her morning run. August came like something that had been building for months and finally stopped pretending. The heat in those first 2 weeks of August was not simply hot. It was the kind of heat that changed how people moved and thought and talked to each other, that stripped patience down to its last layers and left people raw in ways they didn't entirely recognize in themselves. Arguments started over nothing. Children who had been reasonably cooperative all summer became impossible. Men who had been cautiously optimistic about rain stopped mentioning rain in the same way you stop mentioning something that has become too painful to discuss. The creek bed had been dry for over 2 weeks. Harlan Briggs had a secondary water source, a spring on his upper property that ran from a different underground source than the creek, and this insulated him from the worst of it, which also meant it insulated him from understanding the worst of it. He still rode his property line in the mornings, looking the way a man looks when he owns the most of something in a place where having the most of something still matters. He still talked about rain as though the subject were under discussion rather than foreclosed. He passed Tamsin's property on the morning of August 7th and stopped his horse at her fence. She was on her 3rd water run of the morning. She heard the horse stop, and she didn't turn around. "Rourke," he said. She kept moving along the row. "Rourke." She set down the cart handles, turned, and looked at him. She did not say anything. She had learned, not from wisdom particularly, but from exhaustion, that Harlan Briggs talked more when he wasn't being prompted, and that more talking from Harlan Briggs produced more information than less. He looked at her field for a long moment without speaking. Up close, which he rarely was, you could see that he was actually studying it. Not the dismissive glance he'd given it in May, but a real looking. The kind that happened when a man who was usually certain about things encountered something that was making him less certain. "You're still producing," he said finally. "Yes." "The Garrett well's going dry." He said it with the flat tone of a man reporting weather. "Howell's already there. Price lost her kitchen garden 2 weeks ago." "I know," Tamsin said. He looked at her. "How much water are you using?" She told him. He did his own version of the calculation she'd already done 6 ways, and she watched him do it. Watched him work through the numbers without saying anything and arrive at the same answer she had, which was that it was a very small amount of water for a very productive result. "The pots," he said. "Yes." He turned this over. Harlan Briggs was not a stupid man. That had never been the problem. The problem with men like him was not that they were unable to understand new things, but that they had too much invested in already knowing things to be comfortable, acknowledging when a new thing was better than what they knew. Where would a person get that many pots this late in the season? He asked. It was not an apology. It was not an acknowledgement of anything that had happened in May. It was a purely practical question asked by a man who had moved past whatever position he'd held and was now in a different place entirely, but who was not going to mark the transition with any more ceremony than this question represented. Tamsin looked at him for a moment. I don't know, she said honestly. I got lucky with the timing. I'd start by checking what broken pottery anyone has. Cracked glazed pots won't work, but cracked unglazed ones will. The cracks don't matter as long as the pot holds water long enough to seep. He nodded once, a short nod, the kind that meant he'd heard her and was already somewhere else in his head. You're well, he said. How deep? 42 feet. Another nod. He looked at the field one more time, and this time Tamsin understood what she was seeing in his face, which was the expression of a man who had made a decision about someone in May and was quietly, privately, without any audience and without any acknowledgement, reversing it. He touched his hat brim and rode on. Tamsin picked up the cart handles and kept moving. She did not feel vindicated. She felt tired, and she had 44 pots left on this run, and the sun was already doing what the August sun in Wyoming did, which was take everything it could reach. The breaking point, the real one, the one that changed the texture of everything, happened on August 14th. The Molina family's oldest son, a boy of about 16 named Felix, came running down the road past Tamsin's property at a pace that told her before she heard anything that something had gone wrong somewhere. She was at the fence, checking the soil around her outermost row, and she called out to him and he stopped, breathing hard, his face doing something complicated. Garrett's youngest took sick, he said between breaths. From the heat. She's bad. Tamsin knew what heat sickness in children looked like. She'd seen it once in Missouri, a cousin's child, and the memory of it was specific and unwelcome. She left the cart where it stood and went inside for her medical kit, which was not a doctor's kit by any stretch, but was what she had. And she was at the Garrett property in 12 minutes, moving at a pace that she would not have called running, but that covered ground. Clara Garrett's youngest was 4 years old. Her name was Dottie, and she had her mother's coloring and, under normal circumstances, a loudness of opinion that was impressive in someone her size. Today she was quiet in a way that 4-year-olds should not be quiet. She was on the bed in the back room with a wet cloth on her forehead that had already gone warm, and Clara was beside her with the specific stillness of a mother who is keeping herself together through an act of sustained will that is costing her everything. Tamsin did not ask questions. She looked at the child, assessed what she was seeing, and started giving instructions. Cool water, fresh cloths. Don't let her sleep yet. Keep her talking if she'll talk. Clara followed the instructions without comment, moving with the efficiency of someone who is grateful to have something concrete to do. The girl's father, Robert Garrett, was standing in the doorway of the room. He was a large man, and the doorway was not quite large enough for the way he was standing in it, all the width of his shoulders taking up the frame. His face was doing the thing that men's faces do when they are frightened and have nowhere to put the fright. Is she? He started. She'll be all right, Tamsin said. But you need to keep her out of the heat, and she needs water. Not well water warm from the bucket. Cool water. Do you have a cellar? Yes. Keep a pitcher down there. Let it cool before you give it to her. Small amounts, often. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on Robert Garrett's face before, which was the expression of a man with no other options accepting help from someone he had previously not taken seriously. It was not comfortable for him. She could see that it was not comfortable, but he nodded, and he moved aside from the doorway, and he went to get the cellar pitcher. Tamsin stayed for 2 hours. By the time she left, Dottie Garrett was awake and complaining about being thirsty, which was both a good sign medically and a relief emotionally, because it meant she was back to her normal volume of opinion. Clara walked her to the gate. Thank you, Clara said. She said it simply, without the layered qualification that gratitude sometimes carries when it's complicated by other things. Just thank you. Keep her cool, Tamsin said. And the water, small and often. She walked back to her own property. The cart was where she'd left it. The pots on this row still needed their morning fill. The sun had not been waiting for any of this. She picked up the handles and kept going. Something had shifted in the settlement after August 14th. Tamsin couldn't have named it precisely, but she felt it in the way people looked at her when she was in town or passed on the road. Not friendliness exactly. The valley was too exhausted and too frightened for anything as uncomplicated as friendliness, but a kind of attention that was different from what it had been. Where before the attention had been the attention given to a curiosity, that woman, the one with the pots. Now it was something more serious, more like the attention given to a person who had information you needed. People started stopping her. The first was a man named Tucker, who farmed 30 acres on the south side of the valley and had 4 children and a wife, and the look of someone who had been doing arithmetic about food and winter for several weeks and didn't like the answers he was getting. He fell into step beside her on the road one morning and walked with her for a quarter mile without saying anything, which she found she didn't mind. Finally, he said, "My brother-in-law's got a kiln, makes roof tile." "Unglazed?" she said. "Mostly, some glazed. The unglazed ones would work. He's 3 days' ride." She thought about it. "Send a letter. Ask him to ship as many as he can spare, even broken ones. I'll give you the specifications, size, clay density, what you're looking for." Tucker walked another 20 steps without speaking. "My wife thinks I should have done this in May," he said. "Your wife was right," Tamsin said. He made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been something else. "Yeah," he said, "she usually is." He slowed down and she kept walking, and that was the end of the conversation. But 2 days later, a note appeared under her door asking for the specifications she'd mentioned, and she wrote them out and left them at the Tucker property on her next trip to the road. What? The second week of August produced another development that she hadn't anticipated, which was that Harlan Briggs called a settlement meeting. He did it the way he did most things, announced it through Fletcher at the general store, sent word through the mail carrier, and showed up at his own barn on a Tuesday evening, as though the gathering was a thing that had naturally organized itself around him, rather than a thing he had convened. 23 people came. Tamsin came because she had been told about it, and because the subject announced was water management, and because she had more actual information on that subject than anyone else in the room, and she was not going to sit in her cabin while other people's decisions about it were made without her. She sat in the third row. She did not sit in the back, which would have been the easier choice, and the one that required less from her. She sat where she could see the front and be seen from it. Briggs stood at the front of his barn with the particular posture of a man who expected to be listened to and generally was. He laid out the situation, the creek, the dry wells, the failed crops, in the direct, unembellished way that was actually one of his better qualities. He didn't soften it. He said what was true, which was that 3 families in the valley were in genuine danger of not having enough food to last winter, and that 2 more were close behind them, and that the question before the settlement was what to do about it. Several men spoke. They talked about sending to the next county for emergency supplies, about the possibility of cooperative food sharing between families who had more and those who had less, about whether the territorial government had any drought relief programs. These were not bad ideas. They were also not enough ideas. Tamsin waited. When the conversation paused, as conversations always did when they'd exhausted the obvious, she raised her hand. Briggs looked at her. His expression did not change in any dramatic way, but something in it acknowledged her in a manner that had not been there in May. "Miss Rourke," he said. She stood up. She was the only woman who had spoken so far, and she felt the attention of 23 people rearrange itself toward her in the specific way that attention rearranges when a person it hasn't fully accounted for stands up. "I want to talk about next spring," she said. A man near the back said, "We're trying to get through this summer." "I know," she said, "but getting through this summer without a plan for next spring is just delaying the problem. The snowpack was thin last year, and there's no reason to think it'll be better next year. If it's not, if we have another drought, and nobody in this valley has an alternative water method ready, we'll be back in this barn having the same conversation, except we'll have used up more of our reserves getting there." A silence. "What alternative method?" someone asked. Not hostilely, just the question. She explained it again, the pots, the buried system, the water savings, the results. She had brought her journal and she read from it. The specific numbers, the daily water usage, the crop survival rate. Not descriptions. Numbers. The kind of numbers that could not be argued with on an emotional basis, only on a mathematical one, and her mathematics were solid. While she was speaking, she noticed something she hadn't expected, which was that several people in the room were looking at her differently from the way they'd looked at her when she walked in. Not all of them. Some of the older men had the fixed expression of people who had decided their position before the meeting started and would not be moving from it. But others were leaning forward slightly in the way people lean when they're actually listening, when the information is landing somewhere real. How much would it cost? Tucker's wife asked from 2 seats over. She'd come with her husband and had been quiet until now. To set up a system for, say, 2 acres? Tamsin had thought about this. She gave a number, a real number, worked out, not approximate. Then she gave a lower number for what it would cost if people shared labor, if neighbors helped each other dig and plant in turns, the way some farming communities organized cooperative work. You can't buy the pots right now anyway, someone objected. There's no potter. I know, Tamsin said. That's why I'm saying next spring. Start thinking about it now. Write to potters in other counties. Order the materials to make them, if you can find someone with kiln access. She paused. Or spend the winter learning to make them yourselves. The clay in the Price Gully is good clay. I tested it. Mrs. Price, sitting in the front row, turned and looked at Tamsin with an expression that was very nearly a smile. Harlan Briggs had said nothing throughout all of this. He was watching her from the front of the barn with an expression she could not fully read, and she found she didn't try very hard to read it, because his opinion of her had stopped being the thing she was orienting herself toward somewhere around day 3 of burying pots, and hadn't really recovered its former relevance since. After the meeting, as people were filing out, he came and stood beside her, not in front of her where he'd have to address her directly. Beside her, which was a different configuration. The clay in the Price Gully, he said quietly. You've actually tested it. Yes, it'll need tempering, but it's workable. He nodded slowly. There's a man in Casper who does commercial pottery. I have business connections there. If you could write to him before winter, she said, and negotiate a bulk order for spring, the cost per family would come down significantly. Another silence. I'll write Monday, he said, and walked away before she could respond. Tamsin stood in the emptying barn for a moment. Then she picked up her journal and walked home in the dark. She had 5 miles to go, and the road was uneven, and the lantern she'd brought was small. And she was tired in a way that had become so ordinary it no longer felt like a condition, just a fact. But the night was still and clear, and the Wyoming stars were doing what Wyoming stars did, which was fill the entire sky so completely that there was almost more light than dark. She walked and thought about clay and spring and whether Briggs would actually write that letter. She thought he would. That was the thing about men like him. Once they were committed to a practical position, they were actually very good at executing it. The problem had never been his competence. The problem had been what he'd thought she was, and he was revising that now, quietly and without ceremony, which was probably the best she was going to get and was enough. On August 21st, she found the first real evidence that her system was doing more than she'd calculated. She was running her morning water route, moving down the eastern rows, when she noticed that the soil between pot positions, soil she hadn't watered directly, soil that existed between the carefully spaced burial sites, was also darker than the surrounding surface. Not wet, not damp in any obvious way, but darker, which meant moisture was present at a level below the surface. The clay vessels were weeping their water outward in a radius larger than she'd estimated. The moisture was spreading. She stopped. She crouched down and dug with her hand about 4 inches into the soil, midway between 2 pot positions. The soil at 4 inches was noticeably cooler than the surface. She sat back. This was not in her calculations. She'd planned for the pots to water the plants immediately adjacent to them. She had not fully accounted for the lateral spread of moisture through the soil matrix, which apparently was more extensive than the pamphlet had suggested, which meant that in her 4-acre field, the actual watered zone was larger than the sum of 300 individual pot radiuses. The spaces between the pots were not dead zones. They were secondary zones receiving water from both neighboring vessels. It explained why the beans on the interplant spaces were performing better than she'd expected. She wrote it in her journal that evening, carefully, with the exact measurements she'd taken. Not because she needed the journal for herself, she understood what she'd found, but because someone else would need to understand it later, and she intended to make sure they could. By the last week of August, 4 families in the valley had begun digging. Not with 300 pots. Nobody had 300 pots. but with what they had. Clara Garrett had her 6 cracked pitchers plus 8 more that a neighboring family had contributed. The Tooker household had received a shipment of 17 unglazed tiles from the brother-in-law's kiln, and Tooker's wife had improvised a sealed-bottom system from them using clay mortar that Tamsin helped her design over the course of 2 visits. A family named Duchamp, on the western edge of the valley, had their teenage son ride to the next town and purchase every imperfect, unsellable ceramic piece from 2 different shops, 17 pieces total, in various sizes, and had buried them across a single acre of their most critical crop area. None of these systems were as complete as Tamsin's. None of them would produce the same result, but all of them would use less water to sustain more plants than open surface watering, and in a valley running out of water, less was a meaningful difference. She visited each property twice. Not to supervise, she did not have that kind of time or energy, but to check the burial depth, the spacing, the soil packing around the vessel necks. To answer the questions that came up once people were actually doing the work rather than just thinking about it. The questions were specific and practical, whether a vessel with a crack in the base was still usable, sometimes yes, depending on where. How to tell if a pot was seeping too fast versus too slow. What to do if the soil around a buried vessel became hard and compacted and seemed to stop accepting moisture. She gave specific answers to specific questions, which was what people actually needed. On one of these visits to the Duchamp property, she helped the teenage son. His name was Henri, and he was earnest in the way that 17-year-olds are earnest when they've decided to take something seriously. Reset 3 vessels that had been buried at the wrong angle. They worked side by side for about an hour without much conversation, and toward the end of it, Henri said, without looking up from the hole he was tamping earth into, "My dad said it won't work." "Okay," Tamsin said. "He said you got lucky with your field." "He might be right," she said. "I don't think he is, but I could be wrong." Henri looked up at her. He had expected, she thought, either an argument or a reassurance, and she'd given him neither, and he wasn't sure what to do with that. "But you think it'll work," he said. "I think it's working," she said. "What it does next is what it does next." Henri nodded slowly. "That's kind of terrifying," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "Most of the useful things are." He went back to tamping earth. She moved to the next vessel. The nights of late August were beginning to carry a different quality of air. Not cool, not yet, but with something in them that was different from the flat furnace stillness of the weeks before. A hint of movement, the suggestion that the season had a limit and was approaching it. Tamsin registered this without confidence, because the difference between a true change in the season and a night that felt different and meant nothing was a difference you couldn't reliably detect from inside a single evening. But she registered it. She was coming back from the Duchamp property one evening when she passed the stretch of fence where she'd stood in May, watching the potter unload his wagon. The pots had been stacked there, 300 of them in their slightly uneven, sun-warm rows. And she had looked at them that evening and felt the specific weight of a decision that was now fully made and could not be unmade. She stopped walking and looked at the fence. The memory of the stack of pots was very clear, and the memory of Harlan Briggs's voice was clear too, and the memory of her own hands starting to blister around day 2 of the digging, and the morning she'd sat on her heels at the end of day 9 and felt the particular thing she'd felt, not triumph, but certainty. She stood there for a moment, in the last gray light of the August evening, and felt the distance between that May evening and this one. It was not a comfortable feeling. It was not a bad one either. It was the feeling of having moved through something genuinely difficult, not gracefully, not without cost, not without the long stretches of pure grinding exhaustion that nobody celebrated or even acknowledged, and having come out the other side still standing. She was tired. She was still tired. The kind of tired that sleep was beginning to address, but hadn't yet fully reached. She had a root cellar that was slowly filling with food. She had a journal with 18 pages of data that several people in the valley were going to need. She had a field that was still green. She turned away from the fence and walked the last quarter-mile home in the dark, and she did not look back at the fence again, because there was no reason to. Everything that mattered was ahead of her now. The harvest to bring in, the knowledge to share, the records to complete before she made the 12-mile ride to the land office. The well was still holding. That was enough for tonight. The harvest didn't come all at once, which was the thing nobody who hadn't farmed seriously understood about harvesting. It wasn't a day or even a week. It was a long, grinding accumulation of decisions about what was ready and what needed more time and what had gone slightly too far and what you could salvage from the ones that had gone too far. And it happened in stages that overlapped each other in ways that meant you were never quite done with one thing before another demanded attention. Tamsin's beans came first. She'd been watching the pods for 2 weeks, checking them each morning on her water run, pressing them between her fingers to feel the seed swell inside. On the 1st of September, she pulled the first full pod and split it open and looked at what was inside. And what was inside was exactly what she'd needed it to be. Full, firm, properly formed seeds that had done what seeds were supposed to do when given water and time and soil. She stood in the row for a moment, just stood there. Then she went and got her basket. The bean harvest took 3 days, which surprised her by taking a full day longer than she'd planned because the yield was higher than she'd calculated. Not dramatically higher, she wasn't standing in some miraculous abundance, but meaningfully higher, in the specific way that a system working better than its minimum estimate produced results you hadn't built into your plans. She had to make a second trip to the cabin for another basket on day 2, and she hadn't anticipated needing a second basket, and that was the thing that told her something she needed to know about what the clay system had actually accomplished. She wrote it in the journal that night, the numbers careful and exact, while her hands ached from the picking in a way that was different from the aching of the digging. Higher up in the fingers, in the small joints, the kind of ache that came from repetitive gripping rather than sustained force. The corn came next, and the corn was where everything became real in a different way. She had been watching the corn since late July, when the silk had gone brown and she'd begun the daily check of pulling back a husk to look at the kernels. Were they filled out? Were they still milky? Had they begun to dent? The ears had developed more slowly than she'd wanted, because the heat had stressed the plants even with the underground moisture, and there had been a period in early August where she genuinely was not certain how many ears per stalk she would get at full maturity. What she got was not perfect. Some ears were shorter than they should have been. Some had gaps where kernels hadn't set properly because the heat had been too much for the pollination during that specific window. She pulled a 100-ear sample on the morning of September 4th and examined each one and wrote down what she saw. Then she did the calculation for the full field. She set down her pencil and looked at the number. It was more than enough. Not as much as a good rain year would have produced, but enough, specifically enough, mathematically enough, to feed her through winter and have seed left over for spring. In a drought year, in a Wyoming valley where every other crop had failed or come close to it, she had enough. She allowed herself exactly the amount of time it took to draw a long breath and let it out. Then she went to get the husking tools. She was on her second day of corn harvest, moving along the eastern row with the methodical efficiency she'd developed for all physical work on this homestead, when she became aware of someone standing at her fence. It was not an adult. She registered the small size first, then the stillness. Children who came to a fence usually fidgeted, called out, threw things at the ground if they were bored. This child was simply standing at the fence and looking at the field with an intensity that was unusual enough to make Tamsin stop and look back. The girl was maybe 7 or 8. She wore a dress that had been let out at the hem recently, a strip of different fabric at the bottom making up the difference. Her hair was in 2 braids that had been neat that morning and were already coming loose in the way that braids always came loose by midday on children who moved through the world without worrying about their braids. She was looking at Tamsin's corn with the expression of someone encountering something they needed to account for but didn't yet have the words to describe. Tamsin walked over to the fence. "You lost?" she asked. The girl looked up at her. "No." "You live near here?" "My grandmother's Mina Price." She said this the way children say things that they believe explain everything, because to them they do. "Ah," Tamsin said. She had met Mrs. Price's grandchildren only at the settlement meeting, briefly, in a group. "What's your name?" "Ruth." "What are you looking at, Ruth?" Ruth looked back at the field. "It's still green," she said. "Yes." "Everything else is dead." "Not dead," Tamsin said. "Damaged. There's a difference." Ruth considered this with the seriousness of a child who took the distinction between words seriously. "My grandmother said your corn would die too," she said. "She said nobody could stop it." "She was worried," Tamsin said. "That's different from knowing." She wasn't worried, Ruth said with the blunt certainty of someone who knew the person being discussed well. She was scared. She does a different thing with her face when she's worried versus scared. Tamsin looked at this child for a moment. What does she do when she's scared? She goes very quiet, Ruth said, and she does things with her hands, like organizing the kitchen things when they don't need organizing. Tamsin knew that kind of scared. She'd had her own version of it in the evenings of early August when the well level had dropped 3 inches in a week, and she'd had to decide whether to reduce the morning water runs and risk the plants, or maintain them and risk the well. And she'd sat at her table and done the math 6 times, trying to make the answer come out different, and the answer kept coming out the same, which was that she had to trust the well or she had to give up on the plants. She'd trusted the well. The well had held. Your grandmother was right to be scared, Tamsin said. It was a reasonable thing to be scared of. Ruth looked at her steadily. Are you scared? Every day, Tamsin said. Less than I was in August. Ruth nodded as though this confirmed something she'd already suspected. My grandmother says you're the one that made this work, she said, gesturing with a wide sweep of her small arm at the field. She says some people are going to say you got lucky, but she doesn't think so. Tell your grandmother I said I'm glad she doesn't think so, Tamsin said. Why? Because her opinion has weight in this valley, and she's not wrong. Ruth seemed to absorb this. Then she said, Can I come in and look? Tamsin had no particular reason to say no. She opened the gate, and the girl walked in and moved through the rows with that particular careful reverence that children sometimes show for things they recognize as significant before they can explain why. She didn't touch anything. She just walked and looked, and Tamsin walked beside her and let her look. Near the far end of the eastern row, Ruth stopped beside one of the pot positions. The soil there was the slightly darker color that indicated moisture in the substrate, and there was a small pile of disturbed earth where Tamsin had filled the pot that morning. This is where the pots are, Ruth said. Not a question. One of them is right there, about a foot down. Ruth crouched and pressed her palm against the soil, the same way Mrs. Price had done on her first visit. The same gesture, whether learned or inherited, Tamsin couldn't know. She held her hand there for a moment. It's cooler, she said. Yes. Ruth stood up. I want to learn to do this, she said. Tamsin looked down at her. Then learn, she said. Start by asking your grandmother to show you the clay in the Price Gully. She knows where it is. Ruth looked up at her with an expression that was calculating in the way that children's expressions are calculating when they're adjusting their model of a person. She said you were difficult, she said. Did she? She said it like a compliment, Ruth clarified, and walked back toward the gate with the purposeful stride of a child who had gotten what she came for. Word traveled in ways that Tamsin did not fully track, because she was not tracking it. She was harvesting, and harvesting left very little attention for anything else. But she became aware, in the way that peripheral awareness works, that her fence line was being visited more frequently than it had been in August. People stopping on the road. People who had been past her property 100 times in 14 months and had looked at it with the standard issue glance of the familiar, and who were now stopping and actually looking. The squash came in during the second week of September, and the squash was the most dramatic evidence of everything, because squash showed its condition plainly in its size and color and the firmness of its skin, and what she was picking was large, heavy, deeply colored squash that had had its roots fed by slow underground moisture all summer, and had put that moisture into growth rather than survival. She pulled the first large squash from the vine on September 9th, and it weighed, she put it on her kitchen scale, 14 pounds. 14 pounds was a good squash. It was not a record squash or a miraculous squash, but it was a 14-pound squash grown in a drought year in a field where the surface soil had been dry as chalk all August, and that was a number with meaning attached to it. She brought it inside, set it on the table, and looked at it for a moment in the way you look at something that represents more than itself. Then she went back out for the next one. It was the Molina family who came first. Not Felix, the son who had run past her fence to tell her about Dottie Garrett. His father, Eduardo Molina, who was a quiet man in his mid-40s, who had come to Wyoming from New Mexico 10 years earlier, and who had, in Tamsin's limited interactions with him, always seemed to be measuring things carefully before speaking. He came on a Saturday afternoon when she was organizing the root cellar, moving through the careful geometry of maximum storage that she'd been planning since spring. She heard his knock at the door. He knocked, even though the door was open, which told her something about him, and came up from the cellar to find him standing in the doorway with his hat in both hands. "Miss Rourke," he said. "Mr. Molina." He looked past her at the cellar stairs, not nosy, but observant. "Your storage is going well." "Better than I expected," she said. "Come in." He came in and sat at the table, and she poured water from the pitcher she kept cool in the cellar and set a glass in front of him. He thanked her and drank some of it, and then set the glass down and looked at it rather than at her. "We're going to have a hard winter," he said. "Yes." "My corn." He paused. He was choosing his words, she understood, not because he was being careful about honesty, but because he was being careful about accuracy. "My corn produced perhaps 30% of what a normal year gives, my beans less." "The squash." He made a small gesture that said what words apparently couldn't convey efficiently. "I'm sorry," she said. "We have enough," he said. "Barely enough. If the winter is not too long." He looked up at her then, directly. "My children. I have 4 children. The youngest is 3. She understood what he was saying without him finishing the sentence, because there was really only one reason a father of 4 came and sat at someone else's table and said what he'd just said. "I can't give you my whole cellar," she said directly, because he was the kind of man who appreciated directness. "I have to account for my own winter, but I have more beans than I can eat and more squash than I planned for. And I have seed, good seed, from plants that survived this summer, which means it's seed from plants that proved themselves." He nodded slowly. "The seed matters more than the food," he said. "The food we can manage. But for spring—" He stopped. "I know," she said. "The seed is what I want to talk about too." She had been thinking about the seed question for 2 weeks, in the way she thought about things she couldn't fully solve yet. Not obsessively, but as a background process, something running underneath the harvesting and the root cellar work and the journal entries. The seed question was complicated because it was also a social question, and social questions had never been her strongest territory. The straightforward version of it was simple. She had seed from drought-surviving plants, and she had the knowledge of the clay system, and both of these things would be more valuable in the valley next spring than they were sitting in her cellar or her journal. Giving them away seemed obvious. The complicated version was that giving things away in a settlement community was not actually simple. It came with its own social architecture, its own set of implications about who owed whom and what was being exchanged, and what it meant that a woman who had been laughed at in May was now the one with surplus. She had seen, in the 2 weeks of the harvest, how people looked at her field and looked at their own fields, and felt something complicated that was not entirely gratitude and was not entirely resentment, but had elements of both. That was a real thing in the world, and she needed to account for it. She discussed this with no one because there was no one to discuss it with in the way she needed to discuss it, honestly, without social calculation, with room for being wrong. She wrote about it in the journal, which was the closest she had to that kind of conversation. What she arrived at, on the evening of September 14th, was this. The decision about the seed couldn't be made by her alone. It needed to be made in the open, in front of people, in a way that gave them ownership of the outcome rather than making them recipients of someone else's decision. If she simply showed up with food and seed and offered it, it would feel like charity, and charity in this valley carried its own complicated weight. If instead she invited people to come and participate, to come and see, to ask questions, to make their own decisions about what they wanted to take and what they wanted to give back eventually, that was a different thing. She wrote a note and asked Henri Duchamp to deliver copies to 6 households in the valley, which he did without asking why, which she found she appreciated. The note said simply that she was inviting neighbors to visit her homestead on the Saturday of the following week to discuss preparations for spring. It said she had seed to share and knowledge to share, and she would have food ready for anyone who came. That last part, the food, cost her some thought. It was calculated, and she knew it was calculated, and she was not apologetic about the calculation. People came to things where food was promised. That was not a cynical fact. It was simply a fact. What happened in the days between the note and the Saturday was something she hadn't fully anticipated, which was that people started arriving before Saturday. Not in large groups. 1 or 2 at a time, usually in the late afternoon when the day's work was done. when they had an excuse to be moving around the valley. They came and they stood at her fence, and some of them knocked, and some of them didn't quite work up to knocking, but looked hopeful, and she let them all in. There was a woman named Pearl Sutton who arrived on Thursday morning with a covered dish of cornbread, her own corn, from her own diminished harvest, set on the fence post when Tamsin was out in the field, just left there with a small note underneath it that said "thank you" in handwriting that had been pressed hard into the paper, the way handwriting looks when the person writing it is putting weight behind the words rather than just forming them. Tamsin brought this cornbread inside and stood in her kitchen with it for a minute. She ate a piece of it at the table. It was good cornbread. Pearl Sutton knew what she was doing. There was Robert Garrett, who came on Thursday evening and stood at her door with a discomfort that was so visible it was almost its own physical presence in the space between them. He was a man accustomed to being useful to other people. And the specific reversal of that position, standing at someone's door as the person in need rather than the person with something to offer, was clearly costing him. "How's Dottie?" Tamsin asked immediately, because it was the thing he'd want to be asked about first. His face shifted. "Better," he said, and the relief in the word was so complete that it answered every question she'd had about how worried he'd actually been. "Running around, you would never know." "Good," she said. "Come in." He came in. He sat at the table. He accepted the water she offered, and then he sat quietly for a moment in the way of a man who has rehearsed something and arrived at the moment of saying it, and found that his rehearsal isn't quite serving him. "My wife told me what you said," he started. "In May, to the men who, when Briggs," he stopped, started again. "I wasn't one of the ones who laughed," he said. "I want you to know that." "I didn't think you were," she said honestly. She didn't actually have a clear memory of who specifically had been present that day beyond Briggs, but she chose to extend this. "I didn't say anything either," he said. "I was there, and I didn't say anything." He looked at his glass. I've been thinking about that. It's not the same as laughing, but it's not nothing." Tamsin looked at him for a moment. This was not something she had expected from Robert Garrett, and she didn't have a prepared response for it, so she said the first thing that was actually true. "It means something that you said it now," she said. He nodded once, still looking at the glass, and she understood that he'd said what he'd come to say, and that the conversation was going to move somewhere easier now. "The corn," he said. "Clara said you might have seed." "I do," she said. "That's what Saturday is about." Saturday came and Tamsin had prepared as well as she could, which included being realistic with herself about the things she hadn't prepared for and couldn't. She had food laid out, bean soup, which she could make in a quantity that would feed a crowd because she had the beans, and the cornbread Pearl Sutton had given her she'd stretched with a new batch of her own, and there were squash roasted with the last of her summer herbs and set out in a large pan that she'd borrowed from her own root cellar stock. She had her journal at the table, open to the pages with the most important numbers. She had the seed, the bean seed, and the corn seed, and the squash seed separated into paper packets with their variety names written on the outside in her careful handwriting, arranged in a row on the shelf above the table. 18 families came. She had not expected 18 families. She had written 6 notes, expecting that some would come and some wouldn't. But word had done what word did in small communities, and 6 families had become 12 families had become 18, and by mid-morning her cabin was full to the point where people were standing in the yard, and she was passing bowls of soup through the door, and the conversation that started inside the cabin had spilled outward until it was happening in 4 separate groups in the yard simultaneously. She stood in the middle of it and felt something she couldn't quite name, not overwhelmed, because she had made herself ready for whatever came, and this came, but something in the neighborhood of overwhelmed. The specific sensation of a situation that had exceeded the boundaries of its original plan and become something larger and slightly out of her control. Harlan Briggs came. She had not sent him a note. He arrived mid-morning with his wife, a woman named Eleanor, who Tamsin had spoken to perhaps 3 times, who moved through the world with a quiet precision that suggested she had long ago decided to reserve her opinions for people and occasions that merited them. And he stood at the edge of the yard and looked at the gathering with an expression that, from across the yard, Tamsin could not read. Eleanor Briggs walked directly to her. "I brought these," she said, and handed Tamsin a folded cloth that turned out to contain seeds. A lot of seeds, from the weight of it, organized into small tied sections within the larger cloth. Harlan writes a lot of letters, Eleanor said. I save seeds. Tamsin looked at the cloth in her hands. These are… what kind? Beans, mostly, Eleanor said. Winter variety. Different strains from 3 states. I've been trading with women in other territories for years. You'd be surprised what travels by mail when people are paying attention. She looked around the yard with the expression of someone who had watched a situation develop from a distance and was finally satisfied with how it had resolved. I'll want a copy of your journal notes, she said. The water calculations. I have some ideas about the clay composition that might interest you. Tamsin stared at her. You've been thinking about this. I've been thinking about water in this valley for 6 years, Eleanor said calmly. I just didn't have the numbers to back it up until you provided them. She nodded at the cloth of seeds. Those are yours. No debt attached. Tamsin held the cloth of seeds and looked at Eleanor Briggs for a long moment. Thank you, she said. Thank yourself, Eleanor said, and walked away to get food. The conversations that happened that Saturday were not orderly. They were not a meeting with a structure and a conclusion. They were the kind of conversations that happen when enough people who share a problem are in the same space with enough information and enough food, interconnected, overlapping, going back and forth between practical and personal in the way that real conversation does, with arguments and agreements and people talking over each other and going quiet and then speaking again. She answered questions for 4 hours. Her voice was hoarse by midday. The questions were specific and practical. How deep? How far apart? What kind of clay? How long to soak the pots before burying them? Whether you could use metal containers instead of clay if you drilled small holes. Whether a smaller number of better-positioned pots beat a larger number of randomly placed ones. She answered what she knew, said plainly when she was speculating, and said clearly when she didn't know. She showed them the journal. People passed it around and read the numbers, and some of them copied sections into their own notebooks. Tucker's wife had a notebook full of notes she'd already made from Tamsin's earlier visits, and she was adding to it. Margaret Howell, who had written everything down on that first visit in July, was in conversation in the corner with Henri Duchamp's father, who had apparently reversed his position on the usefulness of buried pots somewhere between August and September, because he was now asking very specific questions about clay porosity. Mrs. Price was sitting in Tamsin's only armchair. She'd been put there because her knees had been bad that week, and the walk from her property was longer than it had once been, with Ruth beside her on a stool. Ruth had a piece of cornbread in her hand and was listening to everything with the concentrated expression of a child taking inventory. At some point in the early afternoon, Tamsin became aware that the conversation in the yard had shifted, not loudened, not quieted, but deepened, become less questioning and more planning. People were talking about spring, about labor sharing, about who had access to what resources, about the clay in the Price Gully and what it would take to produce enough vessels for multiple farms. She stood in her doorway and listened to this for a while. It had gone beyond her. The conversation had moved past what she'd given it and was now being built by other people with their own contributions, their own ideas, their own knowledge that she didn't have. Tucker was talking about a neighbor county's experience with cooperative farming structures. The Molina family's eldest daughter, a woman of about 25 who'd said nothing in Tamsin's presence before today, was describing a method of clay firing she'd learned in New Mexico that produced a specific porosity without a kiln, using a pit and controlled heat. People were listening to her with the attention they should have brought earlier and were bringing now. Tamsin felt… She searched for the right word for it and found herself choosing relieved. Not because the work was done, not because anything was resolved, but because the thing she'd been carrying alone since March, the numbers, the knowledge, the plan, was now being held by other hands, and those hands were arguing with it and improving it and taking it in directions she hadn't imagined. She went inside and refilled the soup pot. By the time people started leaving in the late afternoon, the seed packets had all gone, every one of them, and had been supplemented by what Eleanor Briggs had brought and by seeds that several other families had contributed, so that the total exchange of seed was larger than anything she'd planned. People were leaving with not just what she'd prepared, but with contributions from other people at the gathering, a cross-pollination of preserved genetics that represented everything the valley's farmers had managed to save from a drought year. Ruth Price left last, trailing behind her grandmother, and at the gate she turned and said, I talked to my grandmother about the clay in the gully. What did she say? She said she'll take me there next week. Ruth looked at her steadily. I'm going to make my own pots. You're 8 years old, Tamsin said. 8.5, Ruth said. My grandmother says age has no relationship to whether a person can do something useful. Tamsin looked at this child and thought about the spring of 1887, when she had walked into a land office at 22 years old, and a clerk had looked at her filing papers, and looked at her and looked at the papers again, and what it had felt like to know what she was capable of and have to prove it anyway. Your grandmother is right, she said. Come find me when you have a pot ready. I'll test the porosity for you. Ruth nodded as though this were the logical conclusion to a straightforward negotiation and followed her grandmother through the gate. Tamsin watched them go. The yard was empty now except for the evidence of the day. A soup bowl someone had left on the fence post, a muddy boot print at the gate, a piece of cornbread half-eaten and abandoned in the corner by someone's child who had found something more interesting than food. She picked up the bowl and left the boot print and the abandoned cornbread. Inside, the cabin felt very quiet after the hours of voices. She sat at the table and looked at her journal, still open to the water calculations page. Someone had dog-eared the corner of one of the pages. She would never have done that herself. And she smoothed it flat with her thumb and looked at the numbers she'd written there in the dark of a March evening when the whole plan had been nothing but rough math and a thin snowpack and a decision that wasn't yet fully made. The numbers still looked right. She closed the journal. Outside, the late September afternoon was doing its particular thing, the light going amber and long across the Wyoming valley, the air carrying that quality that had been building for 2 weeks. Not cold, not yet, but with the first real suggestion of it underneath. She thought about the land office, 12 miles. She needed to do it before the weather changed, before October made the ride unpredictable. She had her journal for the improvement records. She had her filing receipt and her survey papers. She had 14 months of documented work on this land. She'd make the ride next week. Tonight, she had a root cellar to finish organizing and a well level to check and a field to walk once more before the light was gone completely, because she had learned over 14 months that you didn't let a day end without knowing exactly what your land was doing. She stood up, pulled her jacket from the hook by the door, and went back outside. The field was quieter than it had been all summer. The green still holding in the rows, the bean vines starting to dry back now that the pods were taken, the corn stalks standing in their rows with the stripped look of stalks that had given what they had. The squash leaves, broad and beginning to yellow at the edges, covered the ground between. She walked the perimeter the way she always did, checking, noting. At the far corner of the eastern row where Ruth had crouched that morning and pressed her palm against the soil, she stopped and looked at the field from that angle. The angle she didn't often take. The one that looked from the corner back toward the cabin. From here you could see the whole 4 acres in a single view, the scope of it, the scale of the work it represented. She stood there until the light got too thin, and then she walked back to the cabin and started on the evening chores. The well level was steady. She wrote it in the journal before she slept. The week after the Saturday gathering, Tamsin woke up on Tuesday morning and could not get out of bed. Not in any dramatic sense. Nothing had broken. Nothing was acutely wrong. She lay on her back in the gray pre-dawn light, and her body simply presented her with a comprehensive accounting of what she had asked of it since May, and the accounting was not favorable. Her lower back had been manageable for months through the application of willful ignorance and continued motion. But now, in the specific stillness of a morning when the urgency of the summer was finally behind her, it had apparently decided that willful ignorance was no longer an acceptable approach to the situation. She lay there for probably 20 minutes, which was 19 minutes longer than she normally allowed herself. Then she rolled to her side, pushed up slowly, and sat on the edge of the bed and waited for the back to decide what it was going to do. It made its complaints known in the detailed way that backs do, and she acknowledged them internally and stood up anyway, because the well still needed checking and the field still needed walking, and she had a ride to the land office to plan. The ride was the thing she kept coming back to. 12 miles to Carver's Crossing, where the land office was located. She had made the ride twice before, once when she'd filed the initial claim, and once 6 months later for a required interim check on improvement progress. Both times she'd made it in a single day there and back, which was long but manageable in good weather. The second week of October was borderline for Wyoming weather, which meant the ride needed to happen soon, or it needed to wait until spring, and waiting until spring meant going another 7 months without the title stamped and secured. She was not waiting until spring. She spent Tuesday pulling together everything she needed. The filing receipt was in the tin box under the floorboard where she kept documents, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth that had kept it dry through 2 Wyoming winters. The survey documents were with it, folded in their original configuration from the land office, edges softened with handling but intact. The improvement journal. She set it on the table and opened it to the first page and read through it the way you read something you wrote a long time ago and are checking for accuracy, even though she knew every entry in it and could have reproduced any of them from memory. The journal was her strongest piece of evidence. The homestead law required documented improvements, structures, cultivation, habitation. And she had documented everything, every fence post, every measurement of cleared land, every planting date and harvest yield, every repair. The record was meticulous in a way that she had maintained from the first week, not because she'd known she would need it, but because she'd understood that a woman filing a claim alone needed her record to be unimpeachable in ways that a man's record might not need to be. She had understood this from the first day without anyone telling her. Some things you understood from the way the world was arranged. She wrapped the documents in a second layer of oilcloth and put them in her saddlebag and started thinking about the ride. She left before sunrise on Thursday, which gave her the maximum daylight available. The horse, a sturdy, unexciting brown mare she'd bought in her first month on the claim and named Nothing Special in a moment of practical honesty, moved well in the cool morning air, and the road to Carver's Crossing was dry and clear and presented no particular obstacles for the first 8 miles. The last 4 miles into Carver's Crossing were different, because they went through the edge of a neighboring valley where she didn't know the road as well, and where the terrain shifted from the relative flatness of her valley to a series of low hills that had to be taken at an angle. Nothing Special handled them without complaint, which was the horse's primary virtue. She was not fast and not beautiful, and she had an opinion about streams that required negotiation, but she was steady on difficult ground, and she did not spook. Tamsin arrived at Carver's Crossing at mid-morning. The town was larger than her valley's settlement by enough to be notable. It had a proper main street with establishments on both sides, a hotel, 2 saloons, a hardware concern, and the land office, which occupied a brick building near the end of the main street that was distinguished from its neighbors primarily by having a government seal mounted beside the door. She tied Nothing Special at the post in front, checked the saddlebag one more time, and went in. The land office at Carver's Crossing was staffed, on this Thursday morning, by 2 men. The one at the front desk was young, mid-20s, Tamsin estimated, with the specific quality of neatness that indicated he cared about the impression his appearance made and was still young enough to maintain it. The other man was older, seated at a desk further back in the room, and appeared to be doing actual work rather than managing the front. The young man looked up when she came in. His expression went through a sequence that she was practiced enough at reading to follow. Initial assessment, reanalysis, something that was not quite condescension, but was close to its milder cousin, which was the assumption of simplicity. "Help you?" he said. "I'm here for a title certification," she said. "Final proof on a homestead claim." She put the saddlebag on the counter and began removing the documents. "You filing on behalf of someone?" She looked at him. "I'm filing for myself. Tamsin Rourke. Claim number is on the filing receipt." She set the receipt on the counter in front of him. He picked it up with the particular carefulness of someone who wasn't sure what they were looking at. She watched him read it, watched him note the name on the filing, and watched the sequence of small adjustments in his face as he processed the information. "You're the claimant," he said. "Yes." "This is 160 acres." "Yes." He looked at the receipt again. You're living out there alone?" "Yes," she said, for the 3rd time, keeping her voice level. She had learned through the specific education that certain kinds of interactions provide, that the most efficient response to this line of questioning was to answer each question directly and without embellishment, and let the questioner exhaust themselves without giving them anything to push against. "I'll need the improvement documentation," he said. She set the journal on the counter. He looked at it. It was a substantial journal. She had filled in a half-second volume, and the second volume sat on top of the first with a cord tying them together. He reached out and touched the cord without untying it, as though he were estimating the weight of it. "This is the improvement record?" he said. Complete from the first day of occupation, she said. Cultivation records, structure documentation, survey verification, water source records, and harvest yields for both years. She paused. The harvest yields for this year include crop production during a drought period when the creek ran dry in July. The record documents the water management system I implemented that produced a harvest sufficient to demonstrate productive cultivation. She paused again. Which is the standard? The older man at the back desk had looked up. The young clerk looked at the journal, looked at her, and made a decision that she could see him making. The decision to not engage further with whatever it was he'd been about to engage with, and to simply process the paperwork. He untied the cord and opened the first journal. He was quiet for a long time. She stood at the counter and waited. She was good at waiting. She had become good at it by necessity, in a life that required a great deal of waiting, for weather, for water, for seeds to germinate, for people to decide things, for situations to resolve themselves. Waiting was not comfortable, but it was productive when it was the right action, and right now it was the right action. The older man had risen from his desk and was walking toward the front. She had the impression, she could not have said what produced it, that this was not entirely incidental. He was perhaps 55. He had the bearing of someone who had worked in land offices long enough to have seen many things and had developed a specific form of patience from the experience. He stopped beside the young clerk and looked at the journal over his shoulder without being invited to. He read for a moment. Then he said, "August water records," in a tone that wasn't a question and wasn't a command, just an indication of what he was looking for. The young clerk turned pages. The older man read, and Tamsin watched him read, and after a moment he said, without looking up, "You ran your field through a drought with well water and buried clay vessels." "Yes," she said, and produced a harvest. Full bean and squash harvest, corn at roughly 70% of normal year production. He looked up at her then. He had steady eyes and an expression that was professionally neutral in the way that professional neutrality always has something underneath it that the professionalism is containing, and what she read underneath his neutral expression was not the condescension she'd been managing at the counter. It was something closer to genuine interest. "Where did you learn that technique?" he said. "Agricultural pamphlet," she said. "Government publication on Western irrigation methods." There was one paragraph. He looked at her steadily. One paragraph. "The principle was clear enough," she said. "The rest was arithmetic." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said to the young clerk, "Get the certification form." The certification process took the better part of an hour. There were forms with specific language that required specific responses. And there was a section where the improvement documentation had to be cross-referenced with the legal description of the land. And there was a moment in the middle of this process where the young clerk discovered a discrepancy in the survey notation from the original filing that caused a 20-minute interruption while he located the original survey map and compared it against her documentation. Tamsin stood at the counter during all of this. She did not sit down, though there was a chair against the wall. She was not sure, in some complicated way she didn't fully analyze, whether sitting down would communicate something she didn't want to communicate, some willingness to be kept waiting that was different from the tactical waiting she was choosing to do standing up. The discrepancy turned out to be a transcription error from the original survey. Someone had written a compass bearing wrong, and her survey documents, which she'd had independently verified 8 months into the claim, had the correct notation. The young clerk compared the two versions, confirmed the error was in the original transcription rather than in her documentation, and made a note. "Your survey supersedes," the older man said, without looking up from what he was doing. The young clerk nodded and wrote something on the form. And then, at approximately 1 in the afternoon, the older man took the completed certification form and set it on the counter in front of her, and read through it himself one final time. She watched him move through the language of it, his eyes traveling the lines with the particular focus of someone who knows exactly what they're looking for and is confirming it's present. He picked up the stamp. The stamp came down on the paper with a sound that was unremarkable by any objective standard, a soft, solid thump of metal on paper, and left an impression in the official ink that made the document what it now was, which was the legal record of her ownership of 160 acres of Wyoming land. Tamsin looked at the stamp impression. She reached out and took the document from the counter. It was still slightly warm from the ink. She looked at it for a moment, and something moved through her that she would not, later, try very hard to describe. Because some things resist description, and there's more honesty in acknowledging that than in reaching for words that don't quite fit. She folded it carefully along the original fold lines and put it in the oilcloth with the other documents. "Congratulations, Miss Rourke," the older man said. He said it simply, without decoration, which was how she preferred things said. "Thank you," she said. She picked up the saddlebag and walked out. Oh, nothing special had occupied her waiting time by expressing her opinion of the hitching post through a series of small, experimental investigations of its structural integrity. Tamsin checked the post, found it intact, untied the reins, and stood for a moment with her hand on the horse's neck. The main street of Carver's Crossing moved around her in its regular way. Two men coming out of the hardware concern, a wagon pulling slowly past, a dog with specific ambitions about a piece of something near the opposite post. Ordinary afternoon. Nothing acknowledging the document now in her saddlebag. She bought provisions at the general store, not much, what she needed for the ride home, and a few things for the cabin, and ate a meal at the hotel dining room, which she did not do as a celebration exactly, but because she was 12 miles from home and it was 1 in the afternoon and she needed to eat before the ride back. The meal was beef stew that was adequate and bread that was good, and she ate it at a corner table and sat for a moment afterward with her coffee and allowed herself to be still. The document was in the saddlebag hanging on the back of her chair. She thought about May, which she had been thinking about less as September had progressed, but which came back to her now with a specific clarity. The sound of Harlan Briggs's voice at the fence, the weight of the shovel in her hands, the first pot going into the ground at 5:45 in the morning. She thought about August and the barrel and the handcart and the 87 pots on a morning run and the well level dropping 3 inches in a week. She thought about Dottie Garrett and the heat and Clara at her gate saying thank you with her handwriting pressed hard into paper. She thought about Ruth Price, 8.5 years old, pressing her palm into the cool soil beside a buried clay vessel and saying, "I want to learn to do this." She left a fair tip, which she could afford now, and went out to get nothing special. The ride home went faster than the ride out, which was partly the horse's natural tendency toward the barn, and partly that Tamsin wasn't checking the road with the same careful attention in both directions. Going, she'd been assessing. Returning, she was moving. She reached the valley in the early evening, with enough light left to see the shapes of things. The familiar landmarks appeared in their expected sequence. The Price fence line, the Duchamp barn, the stand of cottonwoods that marked the north side of the Garrett property. And she felt the specific sensation of a person returning to a place that is theirs, which is different from arriving at a place that is familiar. This was hers. The paper in her saddlebag said so in official ink. It had been hers before the paper, which she also understood. But the paper mattered anyway. It mattered because the world operated through its papers, and a woman holding her claim only in her own knowledge and her own work was a woman whose claim could be contested by someone with different papers. And she had always known this, had always known the ride to the land office was not a formality, but a necessity. She came up her own road in the fading light, dismounted at the gate, led nothing special to the small barn, and went through the familiar routine of the end of the day: feed, water, brush, check the horse's feet, secure the stall. She did these things slowly and completely, not rushing, letting the routine settle around her like something she was putting back on after having it off for a day. Then she went inside. She made a small fire, more for the light and the normality of it than for warmth, though the evenings were cooling, and heated water for tea, and sat at the table with the oilcloth packet open in front of her, and the certification document unfolded beside the journal. She looked at the two things side by side. The journal. 2 volumes. The covers worn at the corners from being carried and opened and set down and picked up again. The pages dense with her handwriting and with numbers and with the particular accumulation of a 1.5 years of daily observation. The certification, a single official page with the stamp in the language of legal ownership and her name in the precise formal phrasing of government documentation. The journal had made the certification possible. The certification made the journal matter in a way that extended beyond her own records. Together they were the proof of something she had built on this land, not just the structures and the cultivation, but the knowledge, the specific, tested, documented knowledge, of how to grow food in Wyoming without reliable rain. She sat with them both for a while. The following week, before she'd fully settled into the different quality of days that came after the harvest was in and the major work was done, the problem arrived that she had been, on some level, half expecting. It arrived in the form of a visit from a man named Caswell, who managed an eastern land investment concern that had been quietly purchasing homestead claims in the territory for 2 years. She had known he was in the valley. Fletcher at the general store had mentioned him in passing in August, and she'd filed the information without putting particular weight on it, because in August she'd been focused on other things. Caswell arrived on a Monday morning when she was at the well, came through the gate without knocking. The gate was open, and stood at the edge of the yard with the posture of a man who was accustomed to entering spaces he'd been invited to and spaces he hadn't with equal ease. He was perhaps 40, well-dressed in the specific way of someone who dressed well to convey seriousness, rather than because he cared about his appearance, and he had the kind of pleasant, surface-level expression that was either genuine or a professional tool, and she was not immediately certain which. "Miss Rourke," he said, I'm hoping you have a few minutes." She looked at him. She did not invite him to sit down because she had not invited him in. "What for?" she said. He smiled, the kind of smile that had been designed to neutralize exactly that tone of response. "I represent a land investment group with interests in the Wyoming territory," he said. "We've been looking at properties in this valley, and yours came to our attention." "My property is not for sale," she said. "I haven't made an offer yet." "Then we can save each other some time," she said. "My property is not for sale. Whatever offer you are going to make, the answer is no." He looked at her with the expression of someone recalibrating. "I haven't gotten to the number yet," he said. "The number might surprise you." "Numbers don't surprise me," she said. "I do arithmetic for a living." A pause. He tried a different configuration of the smile. "You've had a difficult year," he said. "The drought has been difficult for everyone in this valley," she said. "Yes. Some families are in positions where they need to make hard decisions about their land." "Some families," she said. "Not me." He looked at the cabin, at the barn, at the field in its post-harvest state, the corn stalks standing stripped, the squash vines starting to brown back, the beans cleared. She watched him look at all of it with the assessing eyes of a man who is calculating value, and she felt a precise, cold clarity settle into her that she recognized as the same feeling she'd had at the land office counter, the feeling of having everything she needed and needing to hold it steady. "You produced a crop this summer," he said. Not a compliment, an acknowledgement of a data point. "When most of the valley didn't." "Yes." "That's valuable land then, more valuable than the standard homestead rate." "Yes," she said again, "which is another reason it's not for sale." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at her with a slightly different expression. Not the professional pleasantness, but something more direct, more evaluating. She had the impression that he was deciding whether to try a different approach or to accept that no approach was going to work here. "The group I represent," he said, "has the ability to make things easier or harder for small claims in this territory, in terms of water rights filings, access road usage, that kind of thing." She looked at him steadily. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm describing the landscape," he said, "the territorial situation." "I received my certification last Thursday," she said. "Full title, 160 acres. The documentation is in order and has been verified by the Carver's Crossing Land Office. If your group has concerns about water rights, they can file through the appropriate territorial channels, same as anyone else." She paused. "If they have concerns about anything else, they can put them in writing, and I'll respond to them in writing." Silence. "You've done your homework," he said, and the professional pleasantness had thinned enough that she could see what was under it, which was not particularly alarming. Just a man who had expected a different conversation and was adjusting. "I've been doing my homework since before you arrived in this valley," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he picked up his hat from where he'd been holding it at his side, turned it once in his hands, and nodded in a way that conceded nothing formally, but acknowledged something. "Good day, Miss Rourke," he said. "Good day," she said. She watched him walk back through the gate and close it behind him. He closed it, she noticed, which told her something. And she stood at the well until she heard his horse moving away down the road. Then she let out a breath that she had been, without deciding to, holding. Well, she told no one about Caswell's visit that day, but she wrote it in the journal that evening. The time of arrival, the substance of what was said, the precise language of the implied threat, the name of the company he'd represented, and the way he'd pronounced it. She wrote it down because written things existed in a way that remembered things didn't, and because she had learned this year more thoroughly than she had ever learned anything, that documentation was not a bureaucratic nicety, but a form of protection. She would tell Harlan Briggs about it, not because she needed his help, but because Caswell had said the valley, not just her property, and information that affected the valley belonged to the valley. She also wrote a letter that evening to a woman she'd corresponded with in Laramie, a lawyer who had been recommended to her through a network of women in the territory who shared this kind of information, asking a specific question about water rights filings and what protections a certified homestead claim carried against neighboring corporate interests. The letter went out with the mail carrier on Tuesday. The response, when it came 2 weeks later, was detailed and specific and confirmed what she'd suspected, which was that her position was substantially stronger than Caswell had implied. She filed the response letter in the oilcloth packet with her other documents. October moved through the valley with the particular momentum of a season that has been waiting its turn. The mornings went cold early. Not killing cold, not yet, but the kind of cold that reminded you of what was coming and suggested you make sure you were ready. The trees along the creek bed, which had been dusty and stressed all summer, caught the cold nights and began doing what they did. The cottonwoods going yellow, the willows going a duller gold, the color moving through them in the few days of a Wyoming autumn that was compressed and specific and entirely unlike anything longer. Tamsin spent most of October on the practical work of winter preparation, which was unglamorous and exhaustive and necessary. Firewood. Root cellar organization. The north fence line, which always needed attention before snow. The barn roof, which had a section she'd been nursing for 6 months, and which now needed to be addressed before the weight of snow made a nursing approach inadequate. She also spent parts of October doing something she hadn't fully anticipated when she'd set up Saturday's gathering, which was that people kept coming to ask her things. Not about the clay system specifically. Those questions had been fairly well addressed on Saturday. But the gathering had apparently established something that she hadn't calculated into her planning, which was that her cabin had become a place people came to when they had problems they were trying to think through, because the gathering had demonstrated that thinking through problems was something that happened there. She was not sure how she felt about this. She was sure that she was tired, which was an objective condition rather than a complaint, and that having people come by when she was in the middle of roof repair or firewood splitting required her to stop what she was doing and be present for the conversation, which cost her time she didn't always have. But she also recognized, in the honest way she tried to be honest with herself about things she would have preferred to be different, that the isolation of the past 14 months had its own kind of cost, one she'd been paying without fully accounting for it. The months of doing everything alone, of having no one to check a number with or talk through a decision with, of being the only person who knew the state of her own situation, that had a weight to it that she had managed by not examining it directly. The people coming by were, among other things, company, real company. Not the careful social interactions of the settlement community, where she'd always been at least slightly sideways to the expected role, but people coming to her with real problems and genuine questions, treating her as someone whose thinking was useful. That was different. She sat with this recognition one evening and didn't do anything in particular with it, just let it be what it was. Henri Duchamp came by on the 3rd week of October, and this time he didn't come to ask about pots. He came because he'd been offered an apprenticeship with a surveyor operating out of Casper, which would mean leaving the valley, and he wanted to talk about it. She wasn't sure why he'd come to her specifically. She hadn't been the person he'd known longest in the valley or the one with any obvious connection to surveying, but she thought it might be because she was the person in the valley who had made a decision about her own land that was difficult and had done it without a template. He sat at her table with a cup of coffee she'd given him, and turned it in his hands in the same unconscious way his father turned his hat, which made her wonder whether this was something taught or something inherited. "My father says it's a mistake to leave," he said. "He says surveying is a young man's job that gets old fast." "Maybe," she said. "But he also said that about farming," Henri said, "and he's been farming for 20 years, so." "What do you want to do?" she asked. He looked at the coffee. "I want to know what the land looks like from above," he said. "Not just the part we're on, the whole shape of it." She understood this better than she could have explained. "Then go," she said. He looked up. "You can always farm later," she said. "You can't always go at 17. He was quiet for a moment. "What if I hate it?" "Then you'll know," she said. "And you'll still know how to farm." He left an hour later looking slightly lighter than he'd arrived, which was about as much as any conversation could accomplish, and she stood at her door and watched him go with a feeling she recognized from the root cellar, the day she'd checked the harvest numbers, the specific satisfaction of a thing working out to a real result rather than an approximate one. At the end of October, a morning came that was different from the mornings before it. She woke early, as she always did, and went to the window the way she always did, and looked out at the field. The sky was the particular dark blue of an hour before sunrise, and the field in that light was a series of shapes more than colors. The corn stalks, the bare vines, the surface of the turned earth between rows. And on that surface, covering everything she could see, was a thin white layer that had not been there the night before. Not snow. Too thin. The first frost. She stood at the window and looked at it for a moment. She had known it was coming, had been watching for it for 2 weeks, the temperatures telling their story each morning. But there was still something about the actual arrival of it that was different from knowing it was coming. The frost settled on the field, and on the fence, and on the barn roof, and on the road, and on everything in the Wyoming Valley with the complete and democratic certainty of weather, covering without distinction the green and the brown, and the surviving and the failed, and making everything, at least for this one dawn hour, the same color. She put on her jacket and her boots and walked out. The cold hit her face immediately, clean and specific. The cold of a season beginning rather than a season ending. She walked to the field and stood at the edge of it and looked at the frost on the turned earth. Beneath that earth, 300 clay vessels sat in their positions in the dark, sealed now against the winter by the same ground that had hidden them all summer. She crouched down and pressed her palm flat against the frost-covered soil, cold on the surface. But underneath her palm, after a moment, she could feel what she'd felt all summer when she pushed 4 inches down between pot positions. The suggestion of something different below the surface. Not warmth exactly, just the particular quality of soil that held memory of moisture, that had been fed all summer and retained something of it. She stood up. Her harvest was in her cellar. Her title was in her oilcloth packet under the floorboard. Her journal was on the table where she'd left it the night before, the last entry dated yesterday, and the page not yet closed. 18 families had seed for spring. She stood at the edge of the frozen field in the pre-dawn dark of late October, 1887, and felt the particular weight of a year that had asked everything she had, and had, in the counting, given most of it back. She turned and went inside to make a fire and start the morning. The field could wait an hour. She had been keeping it waiting since before sunrise every morning for 6 months, and it had always been there when she got back. It would be there now. The winter came the way Wyoming winters came, not gradually, not with warning enough to matter, but with the sudden absolute authority of a season that had been waiting just outside the door and finally stopped waiting. The first real snow fell in the first week of November, and it fell for 2 days without stopping, and when it stopped, the valley looked like a different place entirely. The familiar landmarks, the Price fence line, the Duchamp barn, the cottonwoods along the dry creek bed, were still there in their correct positions but had been given new shapes, softened and weighted and quieted by the snow in a way that made the valley feel smaller and more contained, like the world had drawn its edges in. Tamsin had been ready for it. The firewood was stacked and covered. The barn was secured. The root cellar was organized with the precision of someone who had counted every jar and every bushel and every paper packet of seed and knew exactly what she had and how long it would last if she was careful and how long it would last if she wasn't. She had been careful all year. She intended to continue. The first weeks of November settled into a rhythm that was different from every other rhythm of the year that had just passed. Slower, more interior, the hours shaped by cold rather than by water or heat, or the urgent demands of growing things. She repaired equipment. She worked through the stack of agricultural correspondence she'd been deferring since July. She read, which was a thing she'd barely done since March, and the reading felt luxurious in a way it hadn't felt since before the claim, when she'd had more time than she knew what to do with. She also wrote. Not the journal. The journal entries in November were brief and functional, recording temperature and weather and cellar inventory checks, the practical accounting of a winter in progress. What she wrote in November was different. It was an account of the clay system, a formal account, organized not as a daily record, but as an instructional document, written as though for someone who had never heard of it, and needed to understand not just what to do, but why each step of it worked, what the underlying principle was, how to adapt it to different soil types and different crop configurations, and different vessel sizes. She wrote it carefully, over the course of 3 weeks, revising sections when she found that her first version assumed knowledge that a reader might not have. She thought about the Molina daughter who had described the pit firing technique at the Saturday gathering, and she added a section on vessel production that incorporated what that woman had described, with a note attributing it. She thought about Eleanor Briggs's seeds and the information Eleanor had offered about clay composition, and she incorporated that too. By the end of November, she had 31 pages. She made 2 copies, one by hand, which took the better part of a week and left her with a cramp in her right hand that stayed for 3 days, and one that she paid a scrivener in Carver's Crossing to produce when she made a supply run in early December. She kept the original and both copies in separate places, because she had learned this year that the things worth keeping were worth protecting redundantly. She sent one copy to the lawyer in Laramie she'd been corresponding with a letter asking whether there was an agricultural society or territorial publication that might be interested in distributing it. The lawyer's response arrived in late December and said yes, there were 2. Christmas came and went without ceremony, which was how she'd spent it for 2 years. She made a better meal than usual and sat at her table with her book and the fire and the specific quiet of a night when snow was falling outside and the cabin was warm and there was enough food in the cellar that she didn't need to calculate. She thought about her mother, who had died when Tamsin was 19, and about Missouri, which she missed in the abstract way you miss a place you've outgrown. Not enough to go back, but enough to feel the distance sometimes. She thought about the chain of decisions that had brought her to a one-room cabin in Wyoming with a frozen field outside and 300 buried clay pots waiting for spring. And she found, sitting with those decisions, that she couldn't identify the single one that had been the turning point. It had been all of them, each one following from the previous, with the logic of a woman who had decided something fundamental about herself, that she would do the thing, whatever the thing was, rather than wait for conditions to make it easier. Conditions did not make things easier. She had understood this at 22 in Missouri, and she understood it better now at 23 in Wyoming, and the understanding had cost something real to acquire, and she was not sorry she'd paid for it. She washed her one good dish and went to bed. January was the hardest month, the way January always was. The longest distance from the last harvest, and the next one. The point in the winter where the cellar inventory stopped feeling abundant and started feeling like something to be managed. She checked the levels twice a week and did the arithmetic. And the arithmetic was fine, but there was a difference between arithmetic being fine and the visceral comfort of plenty, and in January that difference was noticeable. She was not suffering, she had enough. But she understood in January what the families who'd come to her gathering had been calculating all fall, and she understood it more personally than she would have liked. The Garrett family sent Felix Molina, who was apparently their designated messenger for Cross Valley Communications now, with a jar of preserved plums and a note from Clara in mid-January. The note said that Dottie was thriving, that Robert had stopped arguing with Clara about the practicality of buried vessels, and had in fact spent a portion of December carving wooden forms to use as molds for clay pots, and that they were expecting to have enough vessels produced by March to cover half an acre. The preserved plums were exceptional. Tamsin ate them slowly over the course of a week, making them last. She wrote back to Clara with a note about optimal vessel sizing for different crop root depths, which was information she'd refined in the written account and which she thought would be useful for Robert's mold making. She included a small separate note for Dottie that said only, "Stay out of the August sun and ask your mother about buried pots. You might be interested." Clara's next note, which arrived 3 weeks later, said that Dottie had attached herself to Robert's pot-making project with an intensity that was both impressive and inconvenient, and that she had already broken 2 molds by pressing the clay in too hard, and had opinions about the clay mixture that she expressed loudly and at length. Tamsin read this note twice and felt something she recognized as being close to happiness, which was a feeling she'd been keeping at a practical distance all year and which was apparently now declining to stay at that distance. February brought something she hadn't expected, which was Harlan Briggs at her door. Not at her fence this time. At her door, which he'd ridden 12 miles of winter road to reach, which told her before he said anything that whatever had brought him was not a casual thing. She let him in. He sat at the table, filling the chair the way large men fill chairs, with a slight overflow of presence, and she poured coffee and set it in front of him and sat across from him and waited. He held the coffee without drinking it for a moment. "Caswell came to see me," he said. She had wondered whether Caswell had. "When?" "November. I should have come sooner." He looked at the coffee. "He made an offer on 3 properties in the valley. 2 families are considering it." She felt the particular alertness that real information produced. "Which families?" He told her. One of them surprised her, a family she'd thought was better positioned than Caswell's involvement would suggest. The other didn't surprise her. They'd lost most of their crop and had 4 children, and the winter arithmetic was not working in their favor. "What does Eleanor think?" she asked, because Eleanor Briggs's assessment of things had proven more reliable than her husband's, and Tamsin had stopped pretending otherwise. Briggs looked at her. Something crossed his face that was complicated. The expression of a man who was simultaneously acknowledging that his wife's opinion was the relevant one and being slightly uncomfortable with the directness of that being named. "She thinks we need to do something as a valley before Caswell gets 2 sales and uses them as leverage for a 3rd, he said. "Once he has 2 parcels, he can start making things difficult for the neighbors. Access roads, water rights arguments, the kind of thing that gets expensive to fight." "She's right," Tamsin said. "I know she's right," Briggs said, with the tone of a man who has been married long enough to know he's right about knowing his wife is right. "What are you asking me?" He looked at her directly. "I'm asking what you think we should do." She sat with this for a moment. Not because she didn't have thoughts, she did, but because she wanted to be sure she was saying the ones that were actually useful rather than the ones that were satisfying. "The 2 families considering the sale," she said. "Are they considering it because they want to leave or because they don't see another way to stay?" "The second one," Briggs said. "Both of them." "Then that's where to start," she said. "Not with Caswell, with them." So, what happened over the following 6 weeks was not organized or elegant, and if Tamsin had been asked to describe it, she would have said it was mostly a series of uncomfortable conversations that produced outcomes nobody had predicted going in. The first conversation was between Harlan Briggs and the family she'd been surprised by, a couple named Whitmore, who had more land than most and more debt than anyone had known, which was the specific combination that made Caswell's offer look like relief rather than surrender. Briggs came back from that conversation looking like a man who had encountered something that rearranged his understanding of the landscape, which was what happened when you found out the person you'd assumed was fine was not fine and had not been fine for some time. The second conversation was harder, and Tamsin was part of it. She and Clara Garrett went together to the family whose arithmetic wasn't working, a couple named Sutton, Pearl's husband Ezra, and Pearl herself. On a Wednesday afternoon when Ezra was home and not busy with something that would give him an excuse to cut the conversation short. They sat at the Sutton table and had coffee, and Tamsin did not waste time. "I know Caswell's been here," she said. Ezra Sutton looked at Pearl. Pearl looked at her hands. "We haven't decided anything," Ezra said. "I know," Tamsin said. "I'm not here to tell you what to decide. I'm here because I think you might be making a calculation about your options that doesn't account for everything available." Ezra was quiet. I was a man in his mid-40s with a face that showed his years in the specific way that outdoor work showed years, and he had the dignity that comes from having built something, and the vulnerability that comes from watching what you've built become precarious. "We've got the note on the equipment," he said, "and the seed debt from spring, and the winter stores are—" He stopped. "How much is the note?" Tamsin asked. He told her. Clara beside Tamsin wrote it down without being asked. "And the seed debt?" He told her that too. Together the numbers were significant but not unsurmountable. She looked at them and looked at him. "The seed debt," she said, "I can eliminate. I have seed from this year's harvest. Drought-surviving stock. You can have what you need for spring at no cost. That was always what I intended for the Saturday gathering." Pearl looked up. "The equipment note," Tamsin said, "is something I'd want to talk to Briggs about. He has contacts with the Territorial Bank, and he's been thinking about a cooperative credit arrangement for Valley families. I can't promise anything on his behalf, but I can tell you he came to me last week asking how to help." Ezra Sutton looked at her with the expression of a man encountering something he'd stopped expecting, which was the possibility that his situation had more options than the one being offered by the person who stood to benefit from his having no options. "Why?" he said. Not suspiciously, just the question. She thought about how to answer it honestly. "Because you belong on this land," she said, "and because Caswell doesn't belong in this valley, and because I spent a year figuring out how to hold on to a piece of ground that people told me I couldn't manage. And I'm not interested in watching someone else lose theirs because they ran out of people to problem solve with." Ezra looked at Pearl. Pearl looked at him. "The seed first," Pearl said quietly. "Let's talk about the rest." The Whitmore situation resolved differently, not through debt renegotiation, but through something that surprised everyone, which was that Harlan Briggs, in the course of his conversation with the Whitmores, discovered that what they actually needed was not money, but a specific piece of equipment that Briggs had on his property and was not using. A grain separator that he'd purchased 3 years earlier for a purpose that hadn't materialized, and that had been sitting in his barn taking up space. He gave it to them. Not as a loan, as a transfer, with the documentation. He told Tamsin this when he reported back, and he told it the way he told most things, which was directly and without ornament. She listened and nodded and didn't make a large thing of it because he clearly didn't want it made into a large thing. "That was the right call," she said. "I know," he said. Neither of the families sold to Caswell. Caswell came back to the valley once more in March, made another pass at the Sutton property, and received from Pearl Sutton, who answered the door because Ezra was in the field, a polite and absolutely definitive no that Pearl later described to Clara as the most satisfying word she'd said all winter. Caswell did not come back after that. Whether he found easier territory elsewhere or simply moved on to other calculations, Tamsin didn't know and didn't spend time wondering about. What mattered was that the valley was intact going into spring. Well, March arrived with a particular quality of a season, returning to a place it had been before, familiar and slightly different, the way things are that have gone away and come back changed. The snowpack on the mountains was heavy. She had checked it from the high point of her property in the first week of March, and what she saw was different from what she'd seen a year ago. The white line broad and substantial across the upper ridges, the rock below it covered, the mountain holding what it was supposed to hold. She stood at the high point and looked at it for a long time. A good snowpack did not mean everything would be easy. Good water years had their own problems: flooding, too wet planting seasons, the specific difficulties of abundance after scarcity. But the thin snowpack calculation she'd made a year ago, standing in roughly this same spot with a cold knot in her stomach, looking at exposed rock that should have been covered, that calculation did not apply this year. This year, the mountain looked like a mountain that was going to give the valley what it needed. She went back down and started preparing the field. The pots were still there, all 300 of them, waiting in the ground the way she'd told Ruth Price they would be. She checked a dozen at random across the field, digging down to each one and examining the clay for winter damage, cracking from freeze-thaw cycles, shifts in position from frost heave seal failures where she'd packed the neck. She found 7 with problems significant enough to need replacement and 23 with minor issues she could address without replacing them. The remaining 270 were intact and in position. She noted this in the journal with the same matter-of-fact entry style she'd used all year. 7 replacements needed, 23 minor repairs, 270 intact. It was a better survival rate than she'd estimated when she'd buried them. The 7 replacements came from Ruth Price, who arrived at her gate on the second Saturday of March carrying a cloth bag and looking extremely pleased with herself. The bag contained 11 clay pots of varying sizes, rough in the way that a first attempt at pottery is rough. The walls not perfectly even, the necks slightly irregular, the surface showing the marks of hands that were learning, but serviceable and porous in the way she'd tested by soaking them overnight and watching the rate of seepage. She looked at the pots and looked at Ruth. "You made these," she said. "My grandmother helped with the firing," Ruth said, "but the clay and the shaping were mine." Tamsin picked up the largest one and turned it in her hands. The irregularity of it was honest. It showed the work, showed the learning, showed the particular mark of someone who had done something for the first time and not tried to hide that it was a first time. These are good, she said. Ruth looked at her steadily with the expression of someone who had prepared for several possible responses and was recalibrating for this one. You're not just saying that. I don't just say things, Tamsin said. Ruth nodded, apparently satisfied. I made 4 more that didn't work, she offered, with the matter-of-factness of someone who had absorbed the idea that failures were data rather than verdicts. The walls were too thick on those. The moisture couldn't move through fast enough. That's the most common mistake, Tamsin said. How did you figure it out? I buried one in the yard and filled it and watched, Ruth said. Then I dug it up the next day and checked how far the moisture had moved. She paused. The damp circle was too small. Tamsin looked at her. 8.5 years old, 9 by now, going on something considerably older in the specific ways that mattered. You ran a test, she said. You run tests, Ruth said simply. It's in your journal. You check things. Tamsin set the pot down and looked at the field and looked back at Ruth. I'll use 7 of these for the replacements, she said. You should keep the other 4 for whatever you plant this spring. Ruth's expression shifted into something she was trying to keep from being too visible, which was the expression of someone who has been given exactly what they wanted and is working to receive it with appropriate composure. Okay, she said with tremendous composure. And tell your grandmother... Tamsin stopped. Come here some afternoon and I'll show you how to check all 300 for winter damage. It's a method you should know. Ruth came that afternoon and stayed 3 hours and asked 37 questions that Tamsin counted, not in an annoyed way, but in the way you count things that are worth counting. Spring planting in 1888 looked different from spring planting in 1887, and the difference was visible in a way that Tamsin noticed on the morning she walked out to her field and began her planting, and looked up to see that she was not the only person planting in a particular way. Across the valley, in the fields she could see from her fence line, people were digging, not the broad surface-level work of standard planting. Deeper holes spaced in the configuration she'd described in her written account, the configuration she'd shown people at the Saturday gathering. She could see the Garrett field from her eastern fence, and she could see Robert Garrett and Clara working in it side by side. Robert with the digging, and Clara with what Tamsin assumed were the pots he'd spent December making. The Molina family's eldest daughter had been in correspondence with Tamsin through the winter, refining the pit firing technique into something that could produce vessels without a kiln, and the results had been distributed to 4 families in the valley who didn't have kiln access. There were more clay vessels in this valley in March of 1888 than there had been in May of 1887, and none of them had been purchased from a traveling potter. Most of them had been made by the people who were about to bury them. There was a difference in that. Tamsin couldn't have fully articulated what the difference was between buying a method and building it yourself from the ground up, but she felt it in the quality of what was happening in the valley that spring. People weren't just using her system. They were using the version of it they'd built, the one they understood from the inside, the one they'd tested and adapted and argued with and improved. The Molina daughters' pit firing produced pots with a slightly different porosity than the purchased vessels. She'd worked out the seep rate and had written to Tamsin with the specific measurements, and the rate was actually better for clay-heavy soil, like the Molina acreage, where the standard vessels released moisture slightly too fast. This was a refinement Tamsin had not made, and could not have made, because she didn't have clay-heavy soil on her property. The system was being improved by the people using it, which was the only way any system ever actually got better. She stood at her fence in the March morning and watched the valley working, and she felt the particular thing she'd been unable to fully name last September, which was still not triumph and was still not pride in any simple sense, but was perhaps something in the direction of completion. The sense of having brought something as far as she could, bring it alone, and having watched it become something that didn't need her to carry it anymore. It would continue without her if it had to. That was the whole point. The creek came back in April, which was not a surprise given the snowpack, but was still a relief in the specific way that the return of a reliable thing after its absence is always a relief. Not celebration, just the settling of a tension you hadn't fully noticed you were carrying until it released. Tamsin walked down to the creek on the morning she heard the water moving again and stood at the bank and watched it run. Not high yet. It would get higher through May as the snowmelt continued, but moving, continuous, the water doing what water did when the mountain gave it enough to work with. She stayed for a while. She thought about the calculation she'd made a year ago, standing at this same bank, measuring the waterline on her stick. The numbers had been right. The creek had stopped when she'd calculated it would stop, had stayed stopped for longer than she'd hoped, and had cost the valley what the valley could not afford to lose. And the valley was still here, not unchanged. The year had left marks. 2 families had debt they were still managing. Several farms had soil compaction from the drought that would take 2 or 3 good seasons to fully recover. The Duchamp barn had developed a structural problem over the winter that nobody had noticed until the snow came off the roof and the weight redistribution revealed it. And Henri wasn't there to help because Henri was in Casper learning to read the shape of the land from above, which was where he was supposed to be. Things were not fixed in the sense of having been returned to their prior condition. They were continuing, which was different and more honest and in the end, more important. She walked back to Old and picked up the work. In June of 1888, a letter arrived from the Territorial Agricultural Society in Cheyenne. They had received a copy of her written account forwarded through the Laramie lawyer, and they wanted to publish it in their quarterly bulletin, which was distributed to homestead claims across Wyoming and into parts of Montana and Colorado. They were also asking if she would be willing to correspond with a soil engineer at the Territorial University who was apparently doing research on subsurface moisture retention and who had, according to the letter, found her documentation remarkable in the precision of its field measurements. She sat at her table with the letter and read it twice. Then she got up and put a pot of water on the fire for coffee because she needed to think, and she thought better with something to do with her hands. The publication, she decided quickly. Yes. That was the whole purpose of having written the account. The more people who had access to the information, the more people who could use it, the more times it would be tested and refined and improved by someone else's conditions and someone else's problems, the way the Molina daughter had improved it for clay-heavy soil. Information that sat in one place stopped being information and became a record. She wanted it to move. The soil engineer was more complicated because corresponding with a university person about her field measurements meant entering a conversation she didn't have formal credentials to be in, and she knew from experience that the absence of credentials created a specific kind of friction in those conversations that had to be managed carefully. She thought about the land office clerk who had looked at her filing papers and looked at her and looked at the papers again. She thought about the arithmetic being the arithmetic regardless of who did it. She wrote back to the Agricultural Society and said yes to the publication and yes to the correspondence with the soil engineer, and she made sure her letter was specific about what she had and what she didn't have, what her measurements showed, what they couldn't show, what questions she still didn't have answers to. She laid it out plainly, as data, as a person who had spent a year in a field and had numbers to share and was not going to apologize for the numbers or for the fact that she had them. The soil engineer wrote back in August. His letter was 8 pages long and contained 17 specific questions about her methodology. She spent 3 evenings answering them, and the process of answering them, of being asked questions precise enough to require precise thinking, taught her things about her own system that she hadn't fully formalized before. She learned them by trying to explain them to someone who needed to understand them from scratch, which was the specific education that comes only from being asked to teach. She wrote a note in the journal after the 3rd evening. The act of explaining a thing is not the same as the act of knowing a thing, and is sometimes more useful. Well, by the end of summer, the 2nd year of the clay system had produced results across 7 farms in the valley, and while 1888 was not a drought year, the creek ran consistently, the rain came at reasonable intervals, the mountain had given the valley what it needed. The underground watering functioned as supplemental support during the dry stretches of July and early August that still came, as they always came in Wyoming, drought year or not. The results were not identical across the 7 farms. They were variable in the way that results in real fields with real soil and real weather are always variable. 2 farms did better than expected. One did worse because the clay used for that family's homemade vessels turned out to have a higher sand content than ideal, and the porosity was off in a way that released moisture too fast in the first week after filling and too slow in the second. This was a problem Tamsin and the Molina daughter diagnosed together through correspondence, and the solution they worked out, a clay mixture adjustment for the following year's vessel production, went into a letter that Tamsin sent to the Agricultural Society as an addendum to the original publication. The system was getting better, not because she was refining it alone, but because it was now in enough hands that each pair of hands was encountering a different version of the problem, and each encounter produced new information, and the new information moved back and forth across the valley through notes left on fence posts and conversations at the general store, and increasingly through the postal routes that connected the valley to other valleys and other territories. She had started something she could not have continued alone even if she'd wanted to. On the last day of September 1888, Tamsin walked her field perimeter in the early morning the way she walked it every morning, checking. The harvest was in, better than the previous year, which had been better than she'd needed it to be, which meant her root cellar was full in a way that had moved past sufficiency into a genuine surplus that she was already planning around. The corn stalks stood stripped in their rows, the bean vines were drying back, the squash had been cleared 2 weeks ago, and the broad-leafed spaces between rows were empty now, showing the turned earth with its slightly darker color, the persistent evidence of moisture retained at depth even in late September. She stopped at the far corner of the eastern row, the corner where Ruth had crouched that first morning and pressed her palm into the soil, and looked back toward the cabin. A year and a half ago, she had stood at a different angle of this same field and felt the vertigo of total commitment. 281 pots still stacked at the edge, the ground mostly unbroken, the full weight of what she'd decided landing on her all at once. She did not feel vertigo now. She felt something quieter than that and more durable. She had not done this perfectly. She wanted to be clear about that, at least with herself, on a September morning with no one around to hear. She had done it with bad days and miscalculations, and a back that had lodged formal complaints in November, and a period in early August when the doubt had been real and close and specific rather than abstract. She had made mistakes in her written account that the soil engineer's questions had revealed and that she'd corrected in the addendum. She had handled the Caswell situation with less grace than she might have, leading with legalism when the quieter move would have been just as effective. She had done it the way humans did things, which was imperfectly and expensively and sometimes wrong, and had arrived at a result that was real anyway. The field was hers. The knowledge was moving. The valley was intact. Beneath the earth, 300 clay vessels sat in their positions, most of them original, 7 of them Ruth Price's, a few replaced over the 2 seasons for various reasons, and waited for whatever came next. They didn't know what they were part of. They were clay, and they did what clay did, which was hold and release, quietly, underground, in the dark, without anyone needing to acknowledge it for it to work. She had spent everything she owned on an idea that nobody understood, not because she'd been certain it would work. She'd been uncertain in specific and well-documented ways, all of them recorded in the journals that were now on their 4th volume on her table. She'd done it because the arithmetic was right, and the alternative was giving up, and giving up had never once presented itself to her as a real option, and she'd never fully understood whether that was stubbornness or courage, or simply the particular shape of a person who had decided something essential about herself early and had not since found a good reason to revise it. The morning was getting lighter. The valley was beginning its day in the way that valleys began their days. Gradually, with the sounds of livestock and the distant movement of people starting their work, the particular texture of a community in motion. She had a well to check and a fence section to finish before the weather changed, and seed correspondence to answer, and a letter to write to Henri and Casper, who had sent a careful, deliberate letter 3 weeks ago that was ostensibly about surveying methods, but was actually, she thought, about whether he'd made the right choice, and deserved a careful, deliberate answer that acknowledged both things. She turned from the corner and walked back toward the cabin along the eastern row, moving at the pace she always moved through the field, attentive, checking, the ground familiar enough now that she registered anything that had changed overnight without having to look for it. She did not look back at the corner. She already knew what was there. The field was exactly what she'd made it. She went inside and started the fire, and the day began the way days began when you had made your life into a thing you could stand behind, not without cost, not without complication, not without the 100 ordinary difficulties that accumulated into the weight of a year, but yours, fully and finally, and without qualification, the way the stamped paper in the oilcloth under the floorboard said, the way the 4 acres of turned earth outside said, the way the valley that had once watched her bury 300 clay pots and wondered whether she would survive had, in the end, already answered.